Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening. My name is Henry, and I'm from Arizona. I've been a long-haul trucker for about 15 years now. Generally, I'm a pretty cheerful and friendly person with everyone I meet, and my wife constantly criticizes me because she says I'm too trusting, that I act like nothing bad could ever happen to me. I used to brush off her concerns, telling her everything would be fine in such a calm tone that it drove her crazy. Well, I actually knew she was right, and that's why I did try to be more cautious on long trips. But I never expected my friendliness would lead me to one of the most terrifying encounters of my life. I was on a run through Nevada, heading east. It was around 10:30 at night, and I was cruising in my rig, listening to some classic rock and munching on beef jerky, when I started feeling some discomfort in my back and legs. I was beginning to feel tired, so I checked my GPS and saw there was a truck stop just a few miles ahead, near a small desert town. I figured I'd fuel up and stretch my legs before continuing on my route. The truck stop was pretty empty, just a small convenience store where a family had pulled over and a taco stand. A few hundred yards away, I could see some isolated houses, and in the distance, the lights of the town. After filling up with diesel, I parked my rig and walked into the taco stand to grab something quick for dinner. The guy working there was friendly enough and prepared something to go. He asked where I was headed, and while we talked, I kept an eye on my truck through the window. That's when I noticed a girl, maybe 9 years old, approaching my rig and looking at it closely. I watched her, and I was a bit surprised when she looked back at me. She was about 50 feet away, and I saw her smile enthusiastically, so I smiled back. Right then, the taco guy looked at me and asked who I was smiling at. I looked at him and said the little girl standing by my truck, but when he looked up, he didn't see anyone. I turned back, and sure enough, the girl was gone. I found it curious how quickly she disappeared, and how serious the man became. He said in a pretty stern tone, "Be careful about being too friendly with people you don't know." I laughed and told him my wife tells me the same thing all the time. I paid him, thanked him for the food, and climbed back into my cab to eat. I stayed parked at that truck stop for a while, listening to a true crime podcast until around 11:30. I got out to stretch my legs again and said goodbye to the taco guy, who was closing up. I was ready to hit the road, and just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed the girl was across the street, on the road that led into town. I figured someone had sent her back to the store for something, and though it seemed odd to send such a young kid out at night, I supposed it was a relatively safe, small town where people didn't worry much about anything happening to her. She gestured with her hand for me to honk my horn, and I did. It made me happy to see her laugh, so I continued on my way. After the true crime podcast ended, I put on another one about paranormal experiences, and the host's voice kept me company for a long stretch. Since the podcast had a spooky theme, it usually had eerie background music and sound effects to set the atmosphere for the stories. So I wasn't surprised to hear whispers and strange creaking sounds for a while. They all seemed to come from the show. But suddenly, One sounded especially loud and pulled me out of the story. I paused the podcast and sat very still, focused on the road ahead. At that moment, I could have sworn the whisper came from inside the cab of my truck. I was afraid to look behind me, and though after a while I managed to convince myself it was just an echo from the podcast, when I replayed it, it didn't sound the same. That really threw me off, and I didn't want to listen to any more mystery content. I put on an audiobook I'd bought recently and kept driving normally, or tried to, because soon another whisper made me grip the steering wheel tightly and straighten up in my seat. I felt a nasty chill on the back of my neck and a bad feeling, like something terrible was about to happen to me. Did someone get in the truck without me noticing? I wondered while trying not to lose control. I was in a pretty isolated stretch of highway, and if there really was someone else in the truck with me, it wouldn't be smart to get aggressive. What if they had a weapon or something? My imagination started getting the better of me, and I almost had a panic attack thinking my life was in danger. The audiobook was playing in the background, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. I was focused on the cab, trying to hear even the slightest sound coming from back there. However, everything was dead silent. I relaxed, assuming it was just my imagination. And just when I let my guard down and reached for my water bottle, I felt a small hand touch my shoulder and squeeze it. I don't know how I managed to keep control of the truck, because my first reaction was to jerk violently. And for a moment, I let go of the steering wheel, but I kept it steady and hit the brakes. I turned around, and I swear to God I didn't see anything. I turned on the cab light and looked in every direction. Nobody was there. I pulled over to avoid an accident and sat there thinking about what could have happened. Had I imagined it all? That was acceptable when I was just hearing whispers, but that squeeze on my shoulder was very real. I grabbed my phone and called my wife. I didn't tell her what had happened, but I thought talking to her would calm me down, and it actually did. When I felt better, I prepared to get back on the road. I checked my side mirror to make sure no cars were coming, and standing in the middle of the highway, I saw the girl from the truck stop. My first thought was that she had gotten into the truck, but I immediately realized that was impossible, because I had seen her wave goodbye to me at the entrance to the town. I kept staring at her, and the hair on my arms stood up when I saw her raise her hand and signal for me to honk the horn again, with a mocking smile on her face. I fixed my gaze straight ahead and put my truck in gear without looking back. Fortunately, I didn't hear or see anything else that night, and I arrived at my destination around 7 in the morning without any problems. Although I felt terrified at the time, I gradually assumed that maybe it was the spirit of a little girl and that she didn't want to hurt me. She felt attached to me because of my kindness, and that's why she followed me. However, when I told my wife about it, she said something that left me thinking for months. If she didn't want to hurt you, why did she touch your shoulder? You could have had an accident. And she was right. At that moment, I could have lost control of the truck, and that mocking smile when I saw her in the middle of the road was hard to justify. I don't know if the taco guy knew something I didn't, and I haven't had a chance to drive the same route to ask him. But what is true is that from then on, I try not to be so friendly with just anyone I meet on the road. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Paul, and I've been listening to paranormal podcasts for years, since they keep me awake at night when the halls are long. I have a couple of road stories, but without a doubt, this one I'm about to tell you was the one that affected me the most. Before I begin with my story, I want to ask you something. Do you believe in nature spirits? I'm not talking about ghosts associated with human souls or essence. Nothing like that. I'm talking about spirits connected to the earth and animal life. You see, I didn't believe in them. In fact, I didn't believe in anything because I was an atheist. But some time ago, I lived through an experience that directly put my life at risk, and I think it would fit perfectly with what I'm sharing here. Let me give you some context. I was born in Texas, but my mother is from Oregon, and we visited the Pacific Northwest several times when I was a kid to see her family. As for me, I won't go into too much detail about what I did, but let's just say for a long time I couldn't find my place in Texas. Eventually, I ended up traveling to Oregon, and fortunately my cousin Mike helped me find a job where I finally managed to fit in at a lumber company warehouse. After several years and getting my licenses in order, I was able to start working as a trucker for the same company, and that's where my story begins. At first, I drove small trucks, transporting lumber to furniture factories. However, as I gained more experience, my boss entrusted me with bigger rigs, until one day he asked me and a slightly older man named Samuel to travel to the logging area in the Cascade National Forest, east of Portland, because they were short on truckers in the area to transport logs to the sawmills. They gave us a company pickup for the trip, and in about 4 hours we were arriving at the logging zone. I have to clarify that Samuel and I didn't get along well. We'd already had some problems because we're both pretty stubborn, so it was a quiet trip. I was driving, paying attention to all the details of the road to keep from getting bored, and I was shocked by the radical change I saw in the landscape. It was around 5 in the afternoon, and suddenly the thick vegetation was interrupted, giving way to miles and miles of stumps in the earth, many bare trees along the roadside, and piles of branches scattered everywhere. It was an imposing image, and I stopped hearing the typical sounds of the highway. Nothing could be heard, no birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing except the wind coming through the window. I thought that was normal until suddenly Samuel broke the silence. They really went overboard this time. No wonder they sent us out here. I was surprised to hear him, and I thought about asking what he meant by went overboard, but I bit my tongue. I assumed he was talking about the amount of work and kept driving. I couldn't see anything but cut trees and piles of branches on the horizon as night fell. We arrived at a huge depot after about an hour. 8 trailers were loaded with enormous logs tied down with chains. Samuel and I got out and went to talk to the foreman. He explained that we had to take those trucks to a sawmill about 50 miles away and that we could rest there, but it was necessary to make the delivery that same night so as not to delay the company's supply schedules. I accepted without hesitation, but something caught my attention. There were several guys scattered around the warehouse doing nothing, and the warehouse foreman seemed pretty upset. Also, there were more than 2 loaded trucks, but no others were leaving. Suddenly, I heard Samuel say, "Excuse me, boss, but my back's been killing me. I can start at 6 in the morning if you want." I was surprised by that, because I was the one who had been driving, and I was still willing to drive a couple more hours to make the delivery. Foreman exploded and told us that's exactly why we'd gone there in the first place, and he started cursing at everyone in the warehouse, especially all the truckers who were gathered in a corner, the same ones I had seen, because none of them wanted to work. They didn't say anything back or even look at him. I didn't mind going out alone or not, but suddenly the foreman said, "Convince your partner and get both trucks rolling, or I call the head office and have you all fired. You came here to work." I shrugged and took Samuel aside to talk to him. I asked him what was wrong, but he just looked up at the sky. We were in a rural area, so the stars should have been pretty visible, but the night was cloudy and quite dark. He wasn't paying attention to me, and suddenly I noticed something in him I'd never seen before. "What's wrong with you? Are you scared, Samuel?" He looked back at me and quite confidently answered, "The night's not good for driving. Don't start your trailer like this." No matter how much I wanted him to explain why he said that, Samuel simply refused. In retrospect, I know he didn't tell me anything because he knew I wouldn't believe him. I was never superstitious, and everyone knew it, and besides, being pretty stubborn, I would have insisted even more if he told me the real reason he didn't want to leave. I told him we should go right away, that he should get in the truck. It was only going to be 2 hours of driving. Again, Samuel stayed calm, as if he really wanted me to understand him, and he answered in the most serious tone I'd ever heard, "Wait until morning and we'll go. You can't drive tonight. These bastards went too far." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I didn't want to try either. I've always been very impatient and obstinate. It's something I try to improve, but at that moment I didn't feel like listening to nonsense. The company was strict about delivery times, and I didn't want to be penalized for arriving at the sawmill a day late. There was no human way to convince Samuel, and he even told me I was just a brute who didn't understand anything. I was fed up. I told him I'd go alone, and that he'd have to explain to the company why he'd arrived without me. And then he said something that even today gives me chills. "If you even make it there, man." I didn't say anything else to him. I got in the truck and drove off down the dark highway we'd already traveled. The trailer was heavy, and the road had no streetlights, so I drove pretty slowly, about 20 or 25 miles per hour. The silence started making me uncomfortable pretty quickly, so I put on a podcast to listen to something in the background. However, I was focused on the road and couldn't get Samuel's words out of my head. It was obvious he knew something I didn't. Suddenly I started hearing peculiar sounds, birds singing in the distance, and I thought it was the podcast, but I realized pretty quickly that no, the topic they were discussing had nothing to do with it. I started feeling nervous, though I wasn't sure why, and for half an hour I was hearing bird songs, wings flapping, branches breaking forcefully, and other animal sounds coming from the darkness. I thought maybe many were looking for their former home, and I didn't want to attribute it to something supernatural until I noticed a gray flash to my left. I turned quickly and saw it happen again. I couldn't make out what it was, but it reminded me of a flashlight beam. I justified it as a worker being in the field, though at that hour it didn't make sense for anyone to be there. That's what I thought, until I saw a man standing on the side of the road. Since I was going slowly, I could make him out pretty well. He was dark-skinned, shirtless, and was looking to the left. He only turned at the last moment when we made eye contact. I kept watching him in the side mirror, and he stared back at me until he disappeared into the darkness. I was already nervous, but that really agitated me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly while pressing the accelerator. I felt an urgent need to get out of that place, and I made an important mistake. I started looking in all directions except at the road. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something jump in front of the truck, a huge deer about 40 feet away. I was going about 35 miles per hour, and I did something we truckers should never do, especially with such a heavy load. I yanked the wheel out of panic. I tried to hit the brakes, and almost caused the truck to roll over on the road. I hit the deer head on and barely managed to keep the trailer on the road until I could stop. When I realized what had happened, I was crying, incredulous that I'd survived that accident. I ran out of the trailer to check the damage and look for the animal with a flashlight in my hand. I had to walk about 60 feet back to find it, and I swear on my mother's grave, which is the most sacred thing I have, that instead of a dying deer, what I found was a large log about 6 feet long. No person could have thrown such a large piece of wood. I stood there amazed, lit by the truck's hazard lights, and suddenly I felt someone watching me. In the distance, about 100 feet in front of me, was the man from earlier. My legs turned to jelly, and I almost fainted, when suddenly I heard a thunderous crash to my right. From the darkness came several gray deer that crossed the road in one leap, bellowing loudly at the same time. I heard a horrible scream that I assume came from that man. I panicked and ran back to the truck, started it up again, and floored the accelerator. At that moment, I remembered all the prayers I knew from my childhood, and I didn't stop or look to the sides, not even when I started hearing something hitting the logs I was carrying. There was no peace during that entire trip until I was only about 15 minutes away from the sawmill. The night shift workers were amazed that someone was actually willing to show up, but I didn't have a chance to tell anyone what I'd experienced until the next morning. I lay down in the cab, but I couldn't sleep all night. The next morning I waited for Samuel to arrive, and when he saw me, he didn't say anything. He just touched my shoulder and said he was glad I was okay. I didn't talk to him about it, and we didn't become friends, but at least after that I respected him more and listened to his advice. As for what happened, I did some research, and I came to the conclusion that I witnessed nature's wrath. How many large and small lives were lost in that area, I have no idea, but Samuel was right when he said they went too far, and something in that place was very angry. I don't know if the same effect is always generated, but from what happened, I've always waited until dawn to transport loads in places like that. I don't like driving in the rain or when there's bad weather, but sometimes my job requires me to do it. My name is Martin, and I've been a trucker for several years. Throughout my life, I've hauled various types of more or less dangerous cargo, and I've always driven quite carefully, so I'm proud to say I've never had an accident. However, I've also experienced moments of great tension, where I didn't know if I'd be able to get out of the situation alive. It's precisely one of those events that I'm here to tell you about. Back then, I was hauling a pretty heavy load from one state to another, so I had to keep my speed quite low. The truth is, the weather looked pretty good. The sky was blue and clear, without a cloud in sight. The area I was traveling through was quite mountainous, and the highway was somewhat narrow, but that didn't worry me too much as long as the road was dry. Around noon, I stopped at a truck stop to eat. Near my seat, a much older man was eating and struck up a conversation because he liked my truck. He told me he'd also been a trucker, and we talked for a while about the trade. When he asked where I was going, it was the only time I saw him change his attitude, and he asked what route I'd be taking. He advised me to take the secondary route, which went behind several towns and settlements. I asked him why he was telling me that, and he said the route that wound through the mountains was dangerous at that time of year. When I asked him why, he simply said something very bad had happened on that highway, and it was better to avoid it during those months of the year. Although I was quite careful back then and usually listened to locals' advice, It's also true that I didn't like secondary routes, as they usually had a lot of crime. I checked my map and saw that the secondary route would also delay me several hours. So I thanked him for the advice, but told him I had to deliver that load as soon as possible and couldn't detour. He understood, blessed me, and told me to be very careful as the weather was going to get quite nasty. As soon as he left, I spent a while looking at the clear sky. I didn't even feel a cold breeze that would hint at the possibility of rain. I felt a bit sorry for him because I thought he was a slightly senile old man, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I got in my truck and resumed the trip on the main highway. It was alone around 1 in the afternoon and quite quiet, but I was quite impressed to notice such an abrupt change in the climate. A thick fog began to descend from the mountain that significantly limited my vision, and a light drizzle began to fall. I turned on the windshield wipers as the rain intensified, and if I was already going quite slowly, I reduced my speed even more. I'm not exaggerating when I say I was driving at about 20 miles per hour because I could barely see anything ahead. I even turned on my headlights even though it was daytime, since the black clouds that settled over the area darkened the road considerably. The rain increased, and I got worried as the windows began to fog up from condensation. I started feeling an intense cold in my legs and back, and I remembered the words of the old trucker from the stop. I crossed myself because I didn't know what had happened on that highway, but I entrusted myself to God so that nothing similar would happen to me. As soon as I did this, I made out that someone was standing on the side of the road, a woman with brown hair wearing a floral dress. I saw her late, since the fog didn't let me see more than a few yards ahead. As soon as I noticed her, I'd already passed her. I tried to see her again through the side mirror, but I didn't see anything. I assumed I was getting worked up. My imagination was tormenting me with things that didn't exist, and yet I felt some guilt. What if she needed help? I had nowhere to pull over, and if I stopped, I could cause an accident if there happened to be a car behind me. I honked my horn while reducing speed a bit to try to get her attention, but no one came to my call. I only heard the sound of the wind and rain falling on my trailer. I accelerated again. The road was downhill, so I was quite nervous and tried to take the curves very carefully to prevent the wheels from losing grip. At one point, while taking a curve very carefully, I saw a classic blue car pass me on the left. I think it was a Camaro, or maybe a Dodge from the 70s. It was going at full speed, and I got very scared because that could have caused a terrible accident. I still remember clearly the sound of its tires screeching on the asphalt and burning every time it accelerated and skidded around curves. I was horrified by that level of recklessness, and I heard it drive away until suddenly I heard a great impact and the horn of a truck like mine. I assumed the worst. It was quite obvious that the driver's recklessness had caused an accident, and I advanced cautiously, expecting at any moment to find myself with a quite violent crash. I picked up my phone to call emergency services, but I had no signal. The rain kept falling quite hard, and the fog didn't let me see. But suddenly, I saw two people standing on the side. A young man with messy hair in his 20s, and a girl about 18 years old, wearing a floral dress. I recognized her instantly. It was the girl I'd seen minutes earlier. I thought someone had picked her up. I didn't have time to think about it much. I braked and rolled down the passenger window. I leaned out and asked them if they were okay, if they'd been involved in the crash. Neither of them answered me. They just stared at me, and believe me when I tell you I'd never seen sadder looks in my life. I felt very cold in my neck and chest, and I couldn't say anything more. I wanted to ask them if they needed help, or if they wanted me to do something for them, but I didn't dare. I rolled the window back up and started my truck, expecting to see at any moment the remains of a destroyed car crashed against a trailer. But I drove and kept driving for 20 minutes. But I didn't see anything like that. I started questioning what I'd seen and heard, but I'm not crazy, and I've never had hallucinations. I know what I saw, and I'm sure what happened next was totally real. As I advanced down the highway, trying to explain what had happened, I noticed a red drop falling on the windshield, and then another, and another. I sank into my seat trying to look up, and although it seems impossible, it's true. From the coal-black sky, drops of blood were falling that stained my windshield. The windshield wipers struggled so I could see the road. And although for a moment I wanted to brake to avoid having an accident, fear inspired me to keep driving, to be able to get out of that highway as quickly as possible. I was breathing with difficulty, hyperventilating from the nerves I had. I could barely feel my legs from the cold, and I noticed my breath was condensing in clouds. It was like driving in the middle of a freezing winter. I even felt my fingers were numb. The thick red stained the entire windshield, and although it was only for an instant, for just a second, the windshield wipers swept away the blood. And I saw before me a horrible accident, a car, or rather, the deformed remains of a car, embedded against what must have once been the cab of a trailer. It was a tangle of steel, stained with the blood of the accident victims. The windshield fogged up again, and when I looked again, the accident had disappeared. At that point, I couldn't do anything but keep driving, hoping nothing else would happen. My daughter later explained to me that I did something called dissociating. That is, I managed to disconnect from reality for a moment. And I think I drove under the blood rain for about 10 more minutes before clear rain cleaned my windshield. And little by little the storm and fog began to dissipate. I drove the rest of the afternoon until I arrived around 7 at a truck stop where I found an old friend of mine. I told him everything that had happened to me, and although he wasn't much of a believer in the paranormal, he did tell me that on that highway about 30 years ago, there was a quite violent accident. A young man had fought with his girlfriend, and she went walking down the highway. He looked for her, and they left in the car fighting in the middle of a storm. The young man was quite drunk, and they didn't see that a trailer was coming uphill. Both of them and the trucker died instantly. Taking into account what I heard and what I experienced, it became quite obvious that what I experienced was a reflection of that tragedy. And apart from the fear that invaded me, I also felt a lot of sadness, since it was evident that the spirits of those two young people did not rest in peace. A few months later, I passed through the same route, and this time I didn't experience any supernatural events. In fact, the weather was quite clear, and I could see on the side of the road some rusty car parts, plus a large cross. It had some flowers, so I imagine there are still people who remember the accident and make small offerings to those young people, hoping that someday they'll rest. As for me, I try to avoid that route during the months of August and September, and I stay quite safe driving slowly, avoiding rain, fog, and asking God to free me from having a similar fate. My name is Carlos, and I've been a trucker for just a few years. The truth is, I'm pretty new and still making rookie mistakes, but I always listen to advice from my colleagues and don't hesitate to ask for help on the radio. I also meet up with them sometimes, either at truck stops along the way or at the company depot where we work, and I always listen to their paranormal stories and all the things they've experienced on the road. Something they constantly told me was that sooner or later, I'd see something on the highway. Witches, ghosts, shadows, there's always something that initiates you. It's inevitable since too many things happen on the road and a lot of residual energy stays on the highways. I took these warnings quite seriously, assuming that indeed, someday it would be my turn to witness some terrifying event. That made me quite paranoid since I'm somewhat fearful, and when I drove at night or on dark and rainy days, I used to see things out of the corner of my eye, but never anything that couldn't be justified by my own imagination. It's just curious that my first encounter with the supernatural was, in fact, quite peaceful and comforting. Every time I had to undertake a long trip, I'd do a check of the trailer I was going to drive. The company I worked for assigned them to us almost randomly, but that never stopped me and the mechanic from taking a minute to see that everything was in order. But it happens that on one occasion, rushing around, I had to get in the trailer and take off just like that, with the bad luck that halfway through the trip, about a day after I'd left, I started hearing a strange sound in the engine, a suspicious clicking that came from the right side of the truck. I started getting quite nervous, assuming the trailer had some malfunction. What I least wanted was to have to call the company in the middle of the night to report that I'd been stranded halfway with that delivery. I called one of my most trusted colleagues on the radio, and after explaining the situation and telling him where I was, he recommended I detour a couple of miles to a town he knew and spend the night there to avoid damaging the trailer further. He told me, "Don't worry, Carlos. My daughter's godfather lives there and he's a good mechanic. He'll help you tomorrow. Let me call him to tell him you're heading there, but don't hit the highway like that, or the truck might break down on you halfway." I felt a bit calmer and detoured to the town my colleague had told me about. It was quite small, and on the side of the road, I saw a mechanic shop where I stopped. I figured it was the one my colleague had recommended, and since I'd have to wait there, I got out to stretch my legs for a while. The place was completely empty, and except for the light from the street lamps, it was also quite dark. Across the road were many trees, and along the highway I saw several businesses that were already closed. It was normal since it was close to 1 in the morning. I lit a cigarette, and suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I felt a chill down my spine and turned around quite quickly, expecting to see a mugger. I'd even closed my fists in case I needed to defend myself, but in front of me, I only saw an elderly man wiping his hands with an old rag. I remember him quite well. He had short white hair, glasses, and quite hard features, but he smiled at me kindly. He was dressed in work overalls, like those used in a mechanic shop, and he made fun of me, saying, "Did I scare you, son?" I laughed and admitted I was a bit nervous. He asked me why, and I explained the situation with the truck and how it had been making noise for the last few hours. He looked at the trailer and told me that if I gave him one of my cigarettes, he'd take a look at it, since his wife no longer let him smoke. I looked at him, and he seemed quite competent. Besides, he was friendly, so even if he hadn't been a mechanic, I would have given him a cigarette. We stood there smoking for a few minutes before heading to the truck. We opened the hood, and he climbed up to check. I watched him from below while he illuminated the engine with his flashlight. I never knew much about mechanics, so I trusted him when I saw him go into the shop and get some tools. He climbed back up, and while he worked, he asked me things about my life, if I was married, how old I was, and how long I'd been a trucker. I answered him, and when I told him my age, he laughed and said, "My son, Jose Luis, is also your age, 28 years old. You're both still quite young, don't worry, son. Take things calmly." He was a quite pleasant old man, and his advice reminded me a lot of what my dad used to tell me. Also, I was very happy when he closed the hood of the trailer and told me to try it. I got in the cab and started it up. Indeed, the clicking had disappeared. I ran down to thank him and noticed the shop door was closed again. I saw him standing behind a post and thanked him for everything he'd done. When I asked him how much I owed him, he told me to pay his son in the morning, and suddenly he asked me something very strange, to give him his regards. I didn't know quite how to interpret it and assumed maybe they were fighting and hadn't spoken in a while. I assured him I would. He said good night and disappeared down the road that led to town. Since I had to stay to pay in the morning, I didn't get back on the road that night. I went into the cab and fell asleep quite quickly. I don't know if it had any relation, but that night I dreamed about my father. I woke up in a good mood with the first ray of sun and went to have breakfast at a nearby place that had already opened its doors. When I returned, the mechanic shop was already open, and I asked for Jose Luis. Suddenly, a man older than I expected approached me, about 50 years old. I asked him if he was Jose Luis, with quite a bit of doubt, and he said yes, and that he assumed I was Carlos. My colleague had already warned him, and he told me he was going to check my trailer. I told him it wasn't necessary since a mechanic had already helped me the night before. He and the other mechanic were quite surprised, and immediately told me that the only mechanics in town were the two of them. And I told them about the man from the night before, and I realized I hadn't asked his name, but I managed to describe him perfectly, and I saw the surprise on both their faces. "If what you're telling me is true, then you talked to my father last night." I answered that yes, although it seemed strange to me that he told me he was the same age as me. I also asked him if they hadn't seen each other in a long time, since he asked me to give him his regards. Jose Luis began to cry, and believe me when I tell you that although it may seem obvious now, at that moment I didn't understand what was happening. After a minute, he explained that his father, Jose Gregorio, had died many years ago, when he was 28 years old. He had taught him everything he knew about mechanics, and he was the best mechanic he'd ever known. Although he died in peace, it seemed he was still willing to help anyone who needed it. It took me a couple of seconds to process that the night before I had smoked and talked for several minutes with a spirit, but far from being afraid, I felt a bit of peace, and I stayed for a while talking to Jose Luis about what his father was like. When we talked about payment, he told me it wasn't necessary because he hadn't done anything. I said goodbye to him and got in the trailer. The only thing I did as soon as I got in was call my father and tell him I loved him. We chatted for a while before getting back on the road, and I promised him I'd visit him soon. Anyway, it hasn't been the only thing that's happened to me on the road, and indeed I've already experienced 2 paranormal encounters that have been quite terrifying. But without a doubt, this is my favorite since it made me feel a bit of peace and joy. It taught me that not everything supernatural has a negative and terrifying tint, and that sometimes the souls that stay behind have good intentions. My name is Robert, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years. I've driven every interstate from Maine to California, spending countless nights with nothing but headlights cutting through the darkness and the hum of the diesel engine for company. I always believed that life on the road had its own rules, things that only those of us who live on the asphalt truly understand. But what happened to me on this particular run is something I still can't fully comprehend. I'd worked for different freight companies over the years, but 6 months ago I finally managed to buy my own rig. It wasn't brand new, but it was in decent condition, and I got it at a price that honestly seemed too good to be true. I found it listed on a trucker's forum, and the seller, an older gentleman named Earl, assured me the truck was in excellent condition. He said he was selling because his doctor had told him he couldn't handle the road anymore after a mild heart attack. I didn't ask too many questions because, for me, it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. Since it was my first run with the new truck, I decided to bring my wife Sarah and my 4-year-old son Marcus along. It was the first time they'd be joining me on a haul, and I liked the idea of Marcus seeing what Daddy did for a living. The route was a straightforward one, delivering auto parts from Detroit to a warehouse outside of Nashville. About a 10-hour drive through some beautiful Midwest countryside. During the day, everything went perfectly. We stopped at a truck stop diner for lunch. Marcus played with his toy cars in the sleeper cab, and Sarah made sure everything stayed organized. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, and I felt proud showing off my new rig at the fuel stops. But when night fell somewhere around the Kentucky border, something changed. As I was driving through a particularly dark stretch of highway, I started to notice that Marcus was talking to himself in the sleeper cab. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids that age have vivid imaginations, and the road can be boring for a little one. But Sarah turned around and watched him for a while, a puzzled expression on her face. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" she asked with a smile. Marcus, without taking his eyes off a corner of the sleeper cab, said something that made my skin crawl. "The lady." Sarah and I exchanged glances without saying a word. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to worry anyone, but Sarah pressed him gently. "What lady, honey?" Marcus pointed toward a dark corner of the sleeper cab. "She's right there. She's smiling at me." Sarah didn't know what to say and just asked him to try to get some sleep. Marcus nodded and curled up with his blanket, and we convinced ourselves it was just his imagination running wild from being in a new environment. Kids say strange things all the time, right? But the truth was, it felt unsettling and wrong somehow. Hours passed, and everything seemed quiet until, in the middle of the night around 2 a.m., Marcus suddenly screamed and woke up, jolting us both from our quiet conversation about the delivery schedule. "Robert," Sarah called out in a tone I'd never heard from her before. I quickly pulled over to the shoulder and put on the hazards before rushing back to the sleeper cab. When I saw Marcus, my blood ran cold. He was trembling, his face covered in sweat, and there was a massive bruise on his left arm. "What happened?" I demanded, but Sarah just stared at me with terror in her eyes. She examined the bruise more closely and whispered something that made my heart stop. It's a handprint." I looked with my own eyes at what appeared to be the clear outline of 5 fingers. They were longer than normal fingers should be, with an unnatural spacing between them. Marcus was sobbing and clutching his arm. "It was the lady," he said through his tears. "She got angry at me." "Why did she get angry?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Because I didn't want to play with her anymore. I told her I was sleepy. We didn't know how to react." Stepped out of the sleeper cab, took a deep breath, and tried to think clearly. Something was seriously wrong with this truck, something that defied any logical explanation. That's when I remembered how cheap it had been, and how eager Earl had seemed to sell it quickly. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Earl's number, but it was disconnected. The automated message said the number was no longer in service. That made me even more nervous, so I decided to do some research on the truck's history. After several searches using the VIN number, I found something that made my stomach drop. The truck had previously belonged to a driver named Tommy Walsh, who had been murdered. According to the police report I found online, his wife had discovered him with another woman during one of his runs. In a fit of rage, she had stabbed him multiple times inside the cab. When the police arrived at the truck stop, they found her dead in the sleeper cab. She had taken her own life in that very space. I stared at my phone screen, not knowing what to do. I looked back at Sarah, who was still trying to comfort Marcus. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We were living and sleeping in the same space where a horrible tragedy had occurred. And apparently, the woman was still there. Ever since I discovered the truck's history, the atmosphere felt completely different. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the certainty that we had been sharing our space with something that didn't belong in this world. I tried to maintain my composure, but my mind kept replaying the image of Marcus pointing to the corner, seeing a woman smiling, the handprint on his arm, the tremor in Sarah's voice when she saw it. I continued driving in silence, my stomach churning and my skin crawling, feeling like something was watching us. I didn't want to look toward the sleeper cab, but I couldn't help myself. I felt that at any moment, I might see that dead woman smiling at me from the darkness. I didn't tell Sarah what I had discovered. What was I going to say? That we were traveling in the place where a man had bled to death and where his wife had committed suicide. That the same presence that had hurt our son could be with us at that very moment. In the end, I didn't even have to tell her because she must have sensed my distress. At some point, she looked at me and said, "We can't stay in this truck. We need to get out of here now." I agreed, but we both knew I couldn't just abandon the truck in the middle of the interstate. So we decided to finish the delivery, but that night was the longest of my life. Every single second of that night felt eternal, and the whole time I felt those eyes watching me from the darkness behind me. When dawn began to break over the Tennessee hills, I felt momentary relief. It was a false sense of security, like when you think the danger has passed, but deep down you know it's still there. As soon as we reached our destination, I didn't think twice. That same afternoon, I sold the truck. I did it quickly and without giving explanations, without saying anything about what we had experienced. I couldn't carry that burden any longer. I got another rig, one without a history, one that didn't bring something with it that I couldn't see. Since then, we haven't talked about it at home. Not because we've forgotten, but because there are some things that are better left alone so you don't attract worse things. Except sometimes, in the early morning hours, Marcus startles in his sleep and whispers something under his breath. Sarah says it's just trauma from that night. But I'm not so sure, because more than once when I've heard him mumbling in his sleep and I've approached to wake him up, I've felt a presence, like something else is in the room. The same heavy feeling that we experienced in that truck that night. And sometimes, when I'm driving my new rig on those long, lonely stretches of highway, I catch myself checking the mirrors, wondering if she followed us somehow. Because once you've encountered something like that, you can never really be sure you left it behind. My name is Joe, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for over 25 years. I've seen everything out here, horrific accidents, whether that could kill you, and things that just don't have any explanation. But if there's one thing I've never been able to forget, something that still haunts me every time I turn on my CB radio, it's the last conversation I had with Eddie. Eddie and I were road buddies. We didn't work for the same company, but we often ran similar routes through the Midwest and South, especially the overnight hauls. We'd keep each other awake by talking on Channel 19, sharing stories, complaining about dispatchers, talking about our families. Any trucker who spent entire nights behind the wheel knows how lonely those highways can get. And hearing a friendly voice on the other end makes the miles feel less endless. Eddie was one of those guys who always had a joke ready, no matter how bad the day was going. We talk about everything college football, what we were hauling, the truck stops with the best coffee, our plans for when we got home. He had a wife named Linda and 2 teenage daughters who were his whole world. He'd been driving for about 15 years and knew every back road from Chicago to New Orleans. That particular night, we were both running southbound on Interstate 65 through Indiana. It was late October, around 11 p.m., and the fog was starting to roll in thick. Eddie was about 10 miles ahead of me, hauling a load of furniture to a distribution center outside Birmingham. We'd been joking about a particularly rude customer he'd dealt with earlier when his voice suddenly changed. "Hey Joe, there's somebody here asking for a ride," he said, his tone becoming more serious. It didn't surprise me. You see stranded people on the highways all the time, though most drivers are careful about picking up strangers, especially at night. "Be careful, buddy. You know how crazy people can be out here," I replied. "Yeah, I know, but it's a woman. She looks really upset, like she doesn't want to be out here." There was silence for a few seconds, like he was trying to decide what to do. Then, without warning, I heard the sound of his truck door opening and closing. "What's going on?" I asked. "I picked her up. Poor thing," says her boyfriend threw her out after they had a fight. Eddie told me he was going to take her to the next town with a bus station, and that he'd keep talking to me on the radio to make sure everything stayed normal. But something in his voice made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a moment when my gut told me something wasn't right. "You sure about this, Eddie? She seem okay to you?" "Yeah, but she's not talking much, real quiet, just staring straight ahead." We kept chatting about other things for a while. I couldn't hear the woman's voice over the radio, but I figured she probably just didn't want to talk. Eddie was good at making conversation and would surely try to make her feel better about whatever situation she was in. About 25 minutes passed with awkward small talk between us, when suddenly the radio filled with a strange sound. I couldn't figure out what it was at first, but when I listened closer, I realized it was Eddie crying. It wasn't normal crying either. It was a choked, desperate sobbing that sent chills down my spine. I called his handle several times, but he didn't respond right away. Then, through the sobs, I heard him praying. He was mumbling broken prayers, his voice cracking like he was begging for help from something I couldn't see. I tried to calm him down and ask what was happening, but the radio only carried back the sound of his heavy breathing and his voice praying frantically. Then a new sound filtered through the transmission. It was screeching. I can't describe it properly, but it sounded like animals in agony, a high-pitched, distorted noise that made my skin crawl. I couldn't identify what kind of creature would make that sound, but what scared me most was that it seemed to be coming from inside his cab. And then a scream. Eddie was calling for help. His voice was filled with a terror I'd never heard from him before, a pure, gut-wrenching fear that seemed to come from his very soul. Seconds later, there was a heavy thud that echoed through the radio. and then everything went silent. I tried to reach him over and over, but the radio only returned static. I tried every channel, called his name until my voice was hoarse, but there was nothing. I kept driving through the night with my stomach in knots, hoping that at any moment he'd come back on the radio and tell me it was all some kind of sick joke. But he never did. By morning, I met up with other drivers at a truck stop outside Louisville. As soon as I pulled in, one of them asked me if I'd heard about Eddie. My blood ran cold when they asked that question, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. They told me he'd had an accident, lost control of his rig, and slammed into a concrete barrier on an overpass. The impact was so severe that he was killed instantly. After trying to process what I'd heard, I didn't want to ask the question, but I had to. I asked if anyone else had been in the cab with him, but they said no. He was alone. I felt like the ground was moving under my feet. I knew what I had heard. I was there when Eddie picked someone up, when he offered her a ride, when he tried to make conversation with her. There was no way he could have been alone. I decided to drive to the accident scene. I had no idea what I expected to find, but I needed answers. When I got there were still a few state troopers finishing up their investigation. I approached one of them and asked if there was anything unusual about the scene. He looked at me for a moment, like he was deciding whether to tell me something. Finally, he said the only strange thing was the condition they found Eddie in. He said that his eyes were wide open, which wasn't unusual for accident victims. But what caught his attention was the expression on his face. He said Eddie had a look of absolute panic, like he'd seen something terrifying in the seconds before he died. The trooper also mentioned that Eddie's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they had to pry his fingers off. And there were scratches on his arms and neck that couldn't be explained by the crash. I didn't know what to think. I had no way to explain what had happened, but one thought kept repeating in my head. Eddie wasn't alone when he died. There was something in that truck with him, something that no one else saw. I've never talked about this with anyone since. It doesn't make sense to try to explain it when I can't even understand it myself. Now, every time I'm driving at night and I see someone on the side of the road asking for a ride, I can't help but think of that woman Eddie picked up that night. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in thick and the highway stretches empty for miles, I tune to channel 19 and listen to the static, half expecting to hear Eddie's voice one more time, warning other drivers about the woman who shouldn't be there. My name is Steven, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 18 years. I've spent more nights on the road than in my own bed. At this point, I've learned not to get spooked by every little thing, because when you're driving alone in the darkness for hours on end, you start to see and hear things that are there, but you just choose to ignore them. However, there was one night when I couldn't do that. I knew that route well, a stretch of Highway 77 that cuts through the mountains of eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. It was a path that many truckers preferred to avoid because it passed through areas where people claimed to see things. Local legends spoke of strange lights that danced between the trees, and old-timers in the truck stops would tell stories about encounters with what they called witch lights. I'd never seen anything unusual there myself until that October night. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I'd been driving without a break for about 6 hours. There wasn't much traffic, just a few cars every now and then, and the occasional semi in the distance. On my right side, there was nothing but dense forest climbing up the mountainside, with trees so tall and thick that even in daylight you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. The fog was rolling down from the peaks, making everything look even more ominous. As I started descending a gradual slope, I noticed something in the woods to my right, lights moving between the trees. At first, I thought they might be headlights from an ATV or maybe a hunting party, but something didn't add up. They were too high off the ground, moving in a way that wasn't natural, like they were floating through the air. It wasn't the first time I'd heard about these lights. Ever since I started trucking, I'd listened to other drivers talk about the famous witch lights or spook lights that appeared in these mountains. According to the local folklore, these weren't just random phenomena. They were the spirits of women who had died violent deaths in these hills, women who could separate from their earthly bodies and roam the forests as balls of fire. Never believed in any of that, but seeing those lights moving in such an unnatural way made my nerves stand on edge. It wasn't just a single point of light, there were several, like something was moving through the woods at the same speed as my truck. I pressed down on the accelerator, but the lights kept pace, weaving between the trees alongside me like they were following my rig. At that moment, adrenaline was coursing through my body, and I knew something very serious was happening. I was being stalked by something I couldn't explain. Then I heard a thud on the roof of my trailer. It wasn't a loud bang, more like something had landed gently on top of the structure. I checked my mirrors but couldn't see anything, just the forest and those lights that seemed to have gotten closer. My instincts told me not to stop, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down and cracked open my window, trying to listen for any other sounds outside. And that's when I heard it, laughter. But it wasn't the sound of an animal or wind hitting the cab. It was laughter, but not normal laughter. It was like many voices blending into one. A distorted whisper that seemed to come from directly above me. Something was on top of my trailer. I floored the accelerator. The trailer shook as the engine roared, and for a moment I felt something moving up there. I didn't want to look in the mirrors, didn't want to turn around. I just focused on the road and getting away as fast as possible. The lights in the forest also began moving faster, but gradually fell behind. I felt momentary relief when I lost sight of them, but something inside me said it wasn't over. About 15 minutes passed before I dared to ease up on the gas and grab my CB radio. I needed to talk to someone, anyone in the area who might understand what I just experienced. "Anyone on Highway 77?" I asked, my voice dry and shaky. There was a long moment of silence before someone responded. "I'm here, driver. What's your 20? It was another trucker I recognized from previous conversations, but had never met face to face. "You ever see anything strange around these parts?" I asked. Another very long silence followed. "You saw the lights?" he finally asked. "Yeah." "Keep driving and don't stop for anything. You're lucky they let you go." Something in his tone made it clear that he knew more than he was saying, but I didn't want to ask. I wasn't in the mood to hear answers that might make things worse. The rest of the trip continued in silence. When I reached my destination and parked the trailer, I sat in the cab for a few seconds with the engine off, trying to calm my nerves. Then I heard one last sound, a thud on the roof. I don't know how long I stayed there without moving, but when I finally got out to inspect the trailer, there was nothing unusual visible. Just some tree branches stuck to the tarp, as if something had grabbed onto them before letting go. Just as I thought everything was over, a sharp noise echoed through the cab. This time it wasn't coming from the roof or the trailer, it was from the passenger side door. I slowly turned my head and saw a handprint on the glass. It wasn't an old mark from dust or dirt. It looked fresh, with unusually long and thin fingers, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window just seconds before. I didn't dare get out immediately. I sat in the cab with my heart pounding in my ears, staring at that mark as if at any moment the hand that made it would reappear. When I finally gathered the courage to exit and check the truck, I realized I was completely alone. I haven't taken that route since that night. Nobody completely believed me when I told them what I saw. Some said I was making it up. Others mentioned it could have been hallucinations caused by fatigue. But whatever it was, I saw it with my own eyes, and nothing will make me think otherwise. Later, I heard stories about that area from other drivers, tales of people who claimed to have seen the same thing, even worse things. Some said those lights weren't just a bad omen, but demons searching for the souls of lonely people in the night. There are some roads where it's better not to travel alone after dark. And there are some warnings that, no matter how crazy they sound, you'd better take seriously. Because in these mountains, when those witch lights start dancing between the trees, you never know if you'll be the next one to disappear into the darkness. I've always believed that the highway has its own language. Spending so much time behind the wheel teaches you to read its signs, to understand when something doesn't fit. That night, I didn't listen to the warnings. I didn't realize I had taken a path I shouldn't have been on until it was too late. I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Dallas, a route I'd driven probably 50 times before. Everything started at a truck stop outside Flagstaff while I was grabbing a quick coffee before continuing my run. A guy at the counter, probably in his 60s with weathered hands and a trucker's cap, mentioned a shortcut that would save me at least 3 hours of driving time. He said few people used it, that it was a quiet road with no traffic or way stations. I shouldn't have listened to him, but after so many hours on the interstate, any way to cut down the drive time sounded appealing. I had no idea I was about to detour onto a road that didn't seem to exist on any map. The first few miles were peaceful enough. The asphalt wasn't in terrible condition, and there were even a few road signs pointing towards small towns I'd never heard of. But after about an hour, things started getting strange. There were no more signs, no houses, no lights. Just desert scrubland on both sides of the road, and darkness, getting thicker by the mile. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed nothing, like this highway wasn't registered in any database. The satellite connection kept cutting in and out, displaying only blank space where the road should have been. I tried not to worry about it and kept driving, but suddenly I felt a jerk in the steering wheel. The engine started losing power until it died completely. I tried turning it over several times, but nothing. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. I grabbed my CB radio to call for help, but all I got was static. No other drivers were on this frequency. Then I tried my cell phone and managed to get through to 911 after several attempts. They said they'd send a patrol car, but given the remote location, it would take at least 3 hours to reach me. I had no choice but to wait. I got out of the cab to see if I could figure out what was wrong with the engine, but everything looked normal. No signs of overheating, no obvious mechanical failure. I decided to walk a little ways from the road to relieve myself. I wasn't going to just stand there like an idiot waiting. That's when I heard them, screams. They were coming from the desert beyond the highway. At first, I thought it might be coyotes, but then I clearly heard what they were saying. It was a man's voice screaming in pain, begging for help, like someone was torturing him. I froze where I stood. Everything in my gut told me to get back to the truck and lock myself in, but at the same time, there was something in me that couldn't ignore it. What if someone really needed help? I walked toward the desert, trying to locate the source of the sound. I pushed through some sage brush and prickly pear cactus, being careful not to make too much noise. The screams became clearer until I reached a small clearing between some large rocks. What I saw there is something that will haunt me until the day I die. There were 4 men. I couldn't see their faces clearly in the darkness, but I could see what they were doing. 3 of them were holding down a 4th man, while one of them had what looked like a machete. I won't describe exactly what I witnessed, but there was blood everywhere. This wasn't a simple robbery or carjacking. This was an execution. I backed away, trying not to make any noise. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and I felt like at any moment they were going to hear me. But just as I was about to turn and run, I stepped on some loose gravel. The crunch echoed loudly in the desert silence. The men stopped what they were doing immediately. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their eyes locked on me in the darkness. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. The screaming stopped abruptly, and instead I heard footsteps behind me. Someone or something was following me through the desert. I didn't look back. I just ran until I reached the truck, slammed the door, and locked everything. I felt like there was someone outside. I don't know if it was paranoia or if there really was someone there. All I could hear was the echo of those screams in my head and my own heart pounding like a drum. The minutes felt like hours, until I finally saw the headlights of a patrol car in my rearview mirror. When the officers got out, they motioned for me to exit the cab. My legs were shaking, but I managed to get down and tell them what I had witnessed. What they told me next left me more shaken than what I had just experienced. One of the officers looked at me seriously and said, "Listen, you'd better get out of here. Your truck starts now, doesn't it? Then go." I told them they couldn't just ignore something like that they had to investigate. But the other officer interrupted me. "For your own good, don't say anything about this to anyone." I felt sick to my stomach. That's when I knew that what I had seen wasn't just any ordinary crime. These officers knew something they weren't telling me. The police escorted me back to the main highway. They didn't even try to investigate the area I had described. They just made sure I got away from there. When I got back to Interstate 40, I stopped at the first truck stop I found. My hands were still shaking. Another trucker noticed how pale I looked and asked what was wrong. I told him a brief version of what I had seen, and his expression changed completely. He told me never, under any circumstances, to take unknown shortcuts, that those roads didn't appear on maps for a reason, and that it wasn't the first time someone had seen something similar in that area. He also mentioned that some of the local police in those remote areas weren't always what they seemed. Some were on payrolls they shouldn't be on, and others were just too scared to get involved in things that were bigger than they could handle. I never took unknown routes after that night. I don't know if the men in the desert saw me well enough to recognize me later. I don't know if those officers were really involved, or just afraid of getting into something that was beyond their control. All I know is that there are things it's better not to see, and there are places where it's better not to stop, even when someone's life might depend on it. Because sometimes trying to help can get you killed, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. The highway has its own rules, and some roads exist for reasons that decent people shouldn't think about. That shortcut saved me 3 hours of driving time, but it cost me something I can never get back: the ability to trust that help will come when you need it most. My name is Ray, and I've been driving 18-wheelers across this country for over 22 years. I've crossed highways from north to south, coast to coast, through endless deserts, mountains with fog so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead, and stretches where robberies are a daily occurrence. And then there are others where the danger doesn't come from the living, but from something that can't be explained. There are many stories among us truckers, things you hear that at first sound like pure highway folklore. But when you've been in this business for years and you see what's really out there, you realize that some of those stories aren't made up. I lived through one of them, and I swear I wouldn't wish it on anyone. This happened about 4 years ago on a run I had to make from Seattle down to Phoenix. I was in a hurry because dispatch had given me a tight deadline for delivery, but fatigue was starting to hit me hard. Those of us who drive nights know there's a point where exhaustion becomes your enemy, and if you don't stop to rest, you can end up wrapped around a tree or smeared across the median. That's when I decided to pull into Miller's Rest Stop, a place I'd used before. It was a spot on Interstate 84 in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, where hardly any cars passed at that hour. The place barely had a couple of old restrooms, some concrete picnic tables, and a pair of flickering fluorescent lights that cast that sickly yellow glow that barely illuminated anything. I parked the rig, got out with my water bottle, and headed straight for the restroom. I wasn't planning to take long, but just as I was finishing up, I heard something outside. It was a shout, rough and loud, like someone with a raspy voice had screamed with all the strength in their lungs. "Get out!" I stood still inside the restroom. I thought it might be someone arguing or maybe a drunk wandering around, though it didn't make sense since I hadn't seen a single car for miles, and there were no towns nearby. I waited a few seconds inside the restroom, trying to hear something else. But there was nothing, just the sound of wind moving through the dry brush and the chirping of insects in the night. I finished quickly and stepped outside with my phone flashlight, scanning the area around me. Nothing looked out of place, but I had that feeling on the back of my neck, that uncomfortable sensation you get when you know you're not alone, even though you can't see anyone. And then I heard it again. "Get out!" But this time it was different. It didn't come from outside. It didn't come from far away. Someone screamed it directly in my ear. I jumped so hard I dropped my phone, and a chill ran through my entire body. It felt like something was right next to me, breathing on my neck. The shock was so intense that when I bent down to pick up my phone, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There were dark stains on the concrete. Blood stains. I followed the trail with my eyes, and a few yards ahead in the brush, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A human foot. Not a shoe or an old boot left by some traveler. It was a real foot, with pale, dirty skin and rigid toes. The flesh was cut so irregularly it looked like it had been torn off by force. I didn't think twice. I ran to the truck, locked the doors, and put it in gear to get out of there as fast as possible. As I was leaving the rest stop, I looked in my rearview mirror expecting to see someone, the owner of that voice that had screamed at me, but there was nobody there, just the flickering light of those fluorescent lamps illuminating the empty highway. I drove nonstop to the next police station. It took me a while to explain what I had seen without sounding like a lunatic. But when the officers reviewed the footage from my cab's dashboard camera, they became very serious. They couldn't see anyone screaming at me in the video. There wasn't a single human figure anywhere in the footage, but what they could see clearly was the trail of blood on the concrete. The officers went to investigate the rest stop and found the foot exactly where I had seen it, but there were no other remains, no signs of a struggle, and no footprints indicating that anyone else had been there. And there was no evidence of who the victim might have been. The case was filed as an unsolved crime. They never found a body that matched the severed limb, and no missing person reports came in that fit the discovery. It just became another highway mystery, one of those stories that police officers eventually forget because they know they'll never find an answer or they're not willing to look for one. But I don't forget because I know what I heard. I know that something told me to get out. After thinking about it for a long time, I believe the most important thing is that if I hadn't listened to that warning, I probably would have ended up the same way as whoever lost that foot. Now I never stop at isolated places, no matter what. Even when fatigue is overwhelming me, I'd rather keep driving until I find a place with more people around. I learned that there are places where it's better not to stop, and warnings that, no matter how absurd they sound, you'd better heed. Because sometimes, the dead are trying to save you from joining them. The strangest part is that about 6 months later, I was talking to another driver at a truck stop in Nevada, and he mentioned Miller's Rest Stop. He said he'd had a weird experience there too, heard someone telling him to leave, saw blood on the ground. When I asked him when this happened, he said it was just 2 weeks prior. That's when I realized that whatever happened at that rest stop, whatever violent end someone met there, it's still happening. The warning is still being given to anyone who stops there alone at night. I've thought about calling the police to tell them about the other driver's experience, but what would I say? That a ghost is trying to save people from becoming victims of the same crime that killed him. They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I just spread the word among other truckers when I can. I tell them to avoid Miller's Rest Stop on Interstate 84, especially at night. Some listen, some don't. But I figure if I can save even one person from whatever happened to the owner of that foot, then maybe that voice will finally be able to rest. Because I think that's what it wants, not to scare people, but to save them. To make sure that no one else has to die alone in that godforsaken place where help never comes, and the only witness is the wind moving through the sagebrush. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, should have tried to help somehow. But then I remember that foot, torn and pale in the darkness, and I know that whoever that voice belonged to was trying to tell me the same thing he probably tried to tell himself. Get out while you still can. The highway is full of places like that, stops that look normal during the day, but turn into something else when the sun goes down. Places where people disappear, and the only thing left behind is a warning echoing in the darkness, hoping the next traveler will be smart enough to listen. When you've been on the road as long as I have, you start hearing things. Some truckers tell ghost stories, others share legends about accidents. But what happened to me one night a couple years back still gives me goosebumps. It was a long haul like usual. I was carrying a load of construction materials from Phoenix to Dallas. Everything was going smooth, weather was calm, and the highway was nearly empty. The only thing worrying me was my fuel gauge. I'd calculated that I had enough diesel to make it to the next major truck stop, but for some reason, the level was dropping faster than normal. I figured maybe the gauge was acting up, but I didn't want to take any chances. Suddenly, I saw an old, half-rusted sign that read gas station 2 miles. Seemed odd because I didn't remember seeing it before on this stretch, and I'd driven this route 1,000 times. Still, I didn't think much about it. I hit the brakes and took the exit toward the gas station. The place was exactly what I'd imagined from seeing that sign. It was small, with a couple of old pumps and a convenience store attached. But the strangest thing was that nobody was around. I got out and looked around, called out a few times to see if anyone would come out, but nothing. There was just a note taped to the store door that said, "Back soon." I waited by the truck for a while, but the atmosphere was weird. There was hardly any sound, not even crickets, just a heavy silence. Then I heard something. It was like someone dragging something, a dry scraping sound coming from the restrooms at the back of the station. I'm not one to get scared easily, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought maybe someone was hurt or something, so I went to check. As I got closer, I saw that the bathroom door was slightly open and moving a little like someone was inside. I called out asking if everything was okay, but nobody answered. I pushed the door open carefully, and when I went in I realized something wasn't right. The bathroom was freezing cold. It wasn't just normal cold, but the kind of cold that cuts right through to your bones. There were handprints on the mirror, like someone had touched it with a lot of force, but they weren't normal prints. They were small and elongated, like something not human had left them. I didn't stick around much longer. I got out fast and went back to the truck. When I climbed in, I tried to start her up, but the engine wouldn't respond. I turned the key over and nothing, like the battery had died out of nowhere. By then, I was starting to get nervous. I kept checking my mirrors expecting to see someone, but everything was just as empty. Then I felt it, that feeling like someone's watching you. I didn't see it right away, but I knew it was there. I looked toward the store and saw it, a dark figure motionless, standing next to the entrance door. It had no clear features, just a black silhouette, tall, that seemed to be looking directly at me. I don't know where I found the courage, but I turned the key one more time and the engine started. I threw it in first gear and got out of there like my life depended on it. I didn't look back until I was sure I'd covered some good distance, but when I did, the figure was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. I reached a truck stop a couple hours later. I was shaking when I got out of the cab. I went straight to the diner and ordered coffee to calm my nerves. There were a couple truckers at the counter, and after a while, I worked up the nerve to tell them what had happened to me. One of them, an older guy, stopped eating and looked at me seriously. He asked if it was the gas station at the exit before mile marker 40. I told him yes, and he just shook his head. He told me that place had been closed for over 10 years, that the owner disappeared along with several drivers who stopped there. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but since then, nobody stops there. I don't know what I saw that night, but ever since, I always make sure to fill up my tank before taking a lonely highway. I don't trust gas stations I don't recognize anymore. I'm not one to get spooked easily. I've been driving 18-wheelers for over 20 years, and in this job you run into everything. Storms, robberies, impossible roads. But what happened to me a few years back still rattles around in my head. Every time I remember it, I can't help but feel a chill. It was a routine run, one of those you do on autopilot. I was hauling auto parts from Denver to Salt Lake City, a route I knew by heart. The night was quiet and the interstate completely empty. I'd already passed the trickiest part of the drive and had a couple hours left to reach my destination. But like it always happens, fatigue started hitting me hard. I didn't want to stop, but I knew I couldn't risk driving like that. So I decided to pull into a truck stop I saw in the distance. I didn't recognize the place right away, but it didn't seem strange either. It was right off the highway, with a small parking lot, a store, and a couple restrooms in the back. The lights were on, though they weren't very bright, like they were already worn out. I parked, shut off the engine, and got out to stretch my legs. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. There wasn't the usual sound of other trucks or a radio playing, nothing. I figured maybe it was too late and everyone else was already sleeping. So I went into the store to buy some coffee since I needed something to keep me awake. Inside there was a clerk, an older man who barely looked up when I entered. His face caught my attention. He wasn't serious, but his smile was. I don't know how to explain it. Uncomfortable. Like he was trying to seem friendly, but wasn't. In the back of the store, there were two men sitting at a table. They weren't eating, weren't talking, just sitting there, glancing over occasionally. I paid for the coffee, and the clerk asked me something that left me thinking. He asked, "Traveling alone?" I laughed a little nervously and told him yes. He looked at me for a few seconds before giving me my change, like he was sizing me up. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but I already had a weird feeling. I left the store with my coffee and headed to the truck. The first thing I noticed was that my door was slightly open. And man, I'm real careful about that. I always lock my doors tight, especially on the road. I thought maybe I'd gotten careless from being tired, but something didn't add up. I quickly checked inside the cab. Everything was in its place, but I couldn't shake that feeling, like someone had been there. I decided to start up and keep going, but as I pulled away from the truck stop, I started noticing strange things. The side mirrors were slightly moved, like someone had touched them. I always adjust them before leaving, so there was no way they should be like that. I also smelled something weird in the cab, like sweat, but knowing it wasn't mine. I didn't want to think too much about it, so I tried to focus on the road. The problem was that uncomfortable feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I looked in the mirrors, I had the impression that something wasn't right. In one of them, for a second, I thought I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. Something small, like a shadow that disappeared immediately. I figured the fatigue or caffeine was already messing with my mind. I decided to stop at the next service station to calm down a bit. When I got there, several trucks were parked, and that made me feel more relaxed. I got out of the rig and went into the restaurant, and that's where things took another turn. There was a group of truckers sitting at a table talking. I walked over with my coffee, and one of them, an older man, greeted me, and we started chatting. I don't know why, but I felt like I could tell him what had happened to me. I told him about the truck stop, about how the clerk looked at me weird, and about the two guys who were just sitting there doing nothing. I also mentioned the open door and the mirrors. When I finished, the man looked at me seriously. He asked exactly where that truck stop was. I explained the stretch of interstate, and as soon as I did, he got a worried look on his face and told me something that left me cold. That place is known among us. We don't think there are ghosts, demons, or anything like that, but it's not a safe place either. Many travelers have stopped there and then disappear. Nobody knows exactly what happens, but there are rumors that it's not a coincidence. Those people aren't there by accident. Another trucker who'd been listening to the conversation jumped in. He told me that years ago, a friend of his stopped at that same place and never made it home. They found him days later, abandoned in his truck, miles from that stretch. His cargo was intact, but the trailer had marks, like someone had tried to force their way in. I didn't know what to think. On one hand, everything they were telling me made sense, but on the other, it seemed like too much. Could it be that something strange, out of the ordinary, was happening at that place? Or was it more likely that it was people with bad intentions? Neither option made me feel any better. I went back to the truck with that feeling like something was missing. I checked everything again: mirrors, doors, the cab. Everything was in its place, but I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been there. I got behind the wheel and started up, but I couldn't stop looking in the mirrors as I drove away. That night I finished the route without problems, but the thoughts wouldn't let me sleep when I reached my destination. What had really happened at that truck stop? Was it something supernatural, like some believe, or just a group of people taking advantage of the loneliness of the road to do their dirty work? To this day, I don't have the answer, and that's what bothers me most. Sometimes, on my night runs, those memories come back, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed a little longer, if I'd been less cautious, or if I hadn't started the truck in time. Maybe I'll never know, but I did learn something. On the road, it doesn't matter if what you're facing is something paranormal or human. It's always better to stay alert and not trust what seems normal. And especially, don't stop at places you don't recognize. My name's Ramon, and I've been on the road for over 20 years. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or things like that, but after what happened to me a few years ago, I can't explain things with logic. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I think about it, and I still feel a knot in my stomach. It was a quiet winter night, one of those where the cold cuts right through to your bones. I'd made a delivery to a small town near the Canadian border and had to drive back with an empty trailer to the city. It wasn't a long trip, and given the hour, I figured I could drive without traffic. I just wanted to get there fast so I could rest. The trip started normal and the highway was completely empty. Not a car, no lights, nothing. The wind was blowing hard, and the echo in the empty trailer made everything rumble. Sometimes the sound of wind in the box can sound weird, but I was already used to it. However, after passing a sharp curve, I heard something that made me grip the steering wheel tight. It was like a sharp bang inside the trailer, like someone had dropped something heavy. I didn't pay much attention to it. I figured it could be some normal trailer noise from hitting a pothole. But then I heard another bang, louder, and then something that sounded like footsteps. I pulled over to the side of the highway, planning to check it out. I got out of the truck with a flashlight in hand and walked to the trailer. The door was closed with the padlock intact, just like I'd left it when I loaded up the last time. I opened it, shined the flashlight around, and there was absolutely nothing. Just the cold metal walls and an echo that made everything feel bigger than it was. I sighed, closed the trailer again, and kept driving. I told myself it was probably just the typical sounds of an empty box with the wind. But as I kept going, the sounds continued, and each time they were clearer. footsteps going from one side to the other, like someone was walking calmly. Then I heard what sounded like a soft knock on the wall, like someone was tapping from inside. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the radio volume, but the sounds kept going. The worst part came when, through the side mirror, I saw something that froze my blood. There was a handprint marked in the dust on the trailer. And I know this because I'd seen the trailer completely clean when I checked it a few hours earlier. That hand was there, perfectly clear, like someone had placed it from inside. I decided to stop again. My heart was pounding hard as I got out of the truck. I felt a strange energy in the air, like a presence of something I couldn't see. I opened the trailer door, this time with more fear than curiosity, and checked again. The inside was empty just like before, but on the floor I saw something that wasn't there the first time. Shoe prints, like someone had been walking around. I slammed the door shut, feeling even more anxious than I already was. I tried to convince myself that everything had a logical explanation. Maybe they were old marks or something I didn't notice at first. I went back to the wheel, but now I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking in the mirrors, hoping not to see anything else. The sounds not only continued, now they were worse. Loud bangs, almost desperate, like someone was trapped and wanted to get out. Then I heard something I'll never forget, a whisper. It was low, barely perceptible, but it was there. I didn't understand the words, but it sounded like a tired, weak voice, asking for something. I sped up. I didn't want to know what was happening. I just wanted to get to the nearest town, but then the trailer started feeling heavier. The truck was losing speed like it was carrying tons, even though it was empty. I checked the gauges, and everything seemed normal. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of a small town and stopped at a diner where truckers usually rest. As soon as I got out of the truck, I felt like a weight had been lifted off me. I went inside, ordered coffee, and tried to calm down. Some fellow drivers were there, and one of them, an old friend named Julian, noticed something wasn't right. He asked what was wrong with me, and though I hesitated at first, I ended up telling him everything. At first he laughed, saying I was too tired. But when I mentioned the handprints and the whispers, his expression completely changed. Julian stayed quiet for a few seconds, and then told me something that made me feel worse. That trailer had a history I didn't know about. He told me that years back, some migrants had used that same trailer to cross the border. The driver who was hauling it didn't know, and when they got stuck at a checkpoint, he left them locked inside out of fear. Nobody found them in time, and they all died of suffocation in there. Since then, several drivers had reported strange things when hauling that empty trailer. Sounds, whispers, and that feeling that something heavy made it harder to drive. He told me the best thing was to turn in the trailer and forget about it. That night I slept at the diner because I didn't dare go back to the truck. The next day, I drove it straight to the yard and turned in the trailer. I didn't want to explain anything. I just wanted to get away from there. Since then, every time I pass that route, I remember what happened. Maybe it was nerves, fatigue, or a mix of everything. But there's something I can't get out of my head. Those hands in the dust, so clear, like someone had wanted to get out. There are things in this life we can't understand, and I think that night I ran into something I shouldn't have. Now, every time I hear a strange noise in the truck, I can't help but look in the mirror, hoping not to see anything. And I hope I never run into an empty trailer like that again. Look, I was never one to believe in weird stuff, and the truth is I've always thought that truckers, from being alone so much time, sometimes we make up stories to keep ourselves awake. But this experience left me with a chill that still gives me goosebumps when I tell it. Everything happened on a trip I made through the mountains a couple years back. The company I was working for sent me to transport heavy machinery to a construction site in a remote town. The route was a mountain highway, lonely and full of dangerous curves, the kind that don't let you see what's ahead and are barely paved. I'd heard stories about that road, especially in winter when the fog rolls in so thick you can barely see your hands in front of you. But I had to make this trip in the middle of summer, so I figured there wouldn't be any problems. The trip was long, and as usual, I started my journey before dawn to avoid traffic and save time. At first, everything was going well. I was listening to the radio and staying alert, but the further I got from the city, the less signal there was. Suddenly, I was just accompanied by the sound of the engine and the wind on the road, which, to be honest, I actually liked. It was after about 6 hours, already into the afternoon, when I decided to make a stop at a small town to stretch my legs and grab something to eat. I stopped at a little store at the gas station, bought coffee and a couple snacks, and was about to go back to the truck when, turning around, I noticed something I hadn't spotted before. There was a dog standing a few yards from me, a black dog, big, one of those that look like they came out of some legend. It had patchy fur and deep eyes without any expression. It was just looking at me. And it wasn't like those dogs that come up to you or wag their tails looking for you to give them something. No, this one was still, watching me without moving even a little. I ignored it and went back to the truck, thinking it was probably just another stray. But shortly after leaving town, when I'd already forgotten about the dog, there it was again, on the side of the road like it was waiting for me. Now I was really surprised because I couldn't explain how it had gotten there. I wasn't scared or anything, I just thought it was a coincidence. But there was something in its stare. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like it was warning me about something. It made me uncomfortable, so I sped up a little and kept going. The road got more complicated as I climbed the mountains, and the sky started getting cloudy. It was already getting dark, and the light was getting dimmer and dimmer. Right before a sharp curve, among the bushes and trees, I saw it again. There was the dog on the side of the road, in that same motionless position, looking at me. But now, in the middle of that fog that was starting to roll in, the scene had something, I don't know, sinister about it. I started thinking about those trucker stories, about running into strange things on the highway. And though I laughed a little at the idea, part of me started getting nervous. I kept driving without stopping, trying to forget that image. But just when night fell completely, something weird started happening with the truck. First, it was a small tremor in the steering wheel, but I figured it was the weight of the load or a pothole, so I didn't pay attention to it. Then I noticed the brakes weren't responding quite right, like they were a little loose. I got scared, because I knew that on those dangerous downhills, I needed to brake safely. I stopped for a moment in an area where I could pull over and quickly check the truck. I didn't see anything wrong, so I got back in and continued, planning to get to the next stop as fast as possible. Then what I least expected happened. On a dangerous curve, while trying to slow down, the brakes just failed. They didn't respond, and the truck started picking up speed. I tried to control the steering wheel, but the curve was sharp, and all I could do was hold on tight and pray I wouldn't go over the cliff. And there, right in the middle of the curve, I saw it again. The black dog standing in the center of the road. It was looking directly at me, without moving, like it was waiting for me. It was a matter of seconds, but in that moment, I felt a mix of terror and desperation. I knew I wasn't going to be able to brake, and the only thought that went through my head was that I didn't want to crash. I closed my eyes and pulled the steering wheel with all the strength I had, trying to stay on the road. When I opened them, the truck was already stopped, miraculously without a scratch, and the dog had disappeared. I'm not going to lie, I stayed there for a few minutes, shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. There was no trace of the dog, and the truck, although it had had brake problems, now seemed to work fine. It was like it had been a warning. Like that animal had been trying to tell me something, but I didn't listen. When I got to the next town, I stopped at a gas station to check the truck again and catch my breath. There, while I was filling up, an old man came up to me and, seeing me pale, asked if I was okay. I told him what had happened, trying not to sound like a crazy person, and the man just nodded silently. Then he told me something that left me speechless. That black dog, right? You're not the first one to see it. It appears when something bad is going to happen on the road. Some say it's a spirit that watches over travelers. Others think it's a bad omen. Since that night, I haven't seen the dog again, and it's not like I'd want to. But every time I go down a dark and lonely highway, I can't help but remember those eyes, that stare that seemed to know something I didn't. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe that dog was really there to warn me. I don't know, but one thing's for sure. After that night, I don't see the road the same way anymore. This story I haven't told many people. More than anything because it's one of those things you prefer not to remember. But, well, since we're here, I think it's worth bringing up. My name's Manuel, but everyone in the business calls me Big Mike. I've been driving 18-wheelers for almost 20 years, and I swear I've seen everything on the highways. But what happened that night? That really changed me completely. It was a normal route, a load of auto parts from Minneapolis to Kansas City. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had to drive at night because the load was running behind, and you know how it is. Better to listen to the boss than to caution. The night was quiet, not much traffic and clear skies. I'd gone about 200 miles when I got to a stretch that's always seemed weird to me, a really long straight stretch where there's barely any lighting and the hills are far away. Everyone calls it the Devil's Mouth. I never knew why. Everything was going fine until, in the side mirrors, I saw the lights of another 18-wheeler coming up behind me. It was strange because I'd gone a while without passing anyone, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes you get lost in your thoughts or listening to the radio, and before you know it, you've got company. I focused on the road, but the lights from that truck didn't move. They were always right behind me at the same distance. It didn't get closer or further away. A few minutes went by, and suddenly I saw that the driver of the truck started signaling me with his lights. First, I thought he wanted to pass me, so I turned on my signal and pulled over a little. But no, the truck stayed behind, without moving. Then he flashed his lights again, this time in stranger patterns, like he was making code. That's when I got nervous. What could that mean? I don't know why, but instinctively I looked in the cab's rearview mirror, And there I saw it. It wasn't my imagination, I swear. There was a figure, like a man, sitting behind me on the sleeper. It was dark, like it had no face. I froze and felt like I was going to have a heart attack. When I reacted, I turned my head to look at it directly. But there was nobody there, empty, everything normal. And that scared me more because I knew I'd seen it. I wasn't dreaming. The signals from the other truck continued, faster and faster, like the driver was desperate. I slowed down to try to understand what he was trying to tell me. And then I saw something that froze my blood. The truck's lights seemed to form words. It was a message that only a trucker would understand. Check load. I pulled over to the side of the highway, shaking. I thought something had fallen off or that my load was badly secured. I got out of the truck with a flashlight to check. Everything was in order. The tarps properly placed, the seals intact. Nothing weird. Then I heard a sound, like a whisper, coming from inside the trailer. It was impossible for someone to be in there, but the noise continued, soft and persistent. A kind of lament. I got back in the truck without having found anything. When I looked in the mirror, the other truck was no longer there. Only the empty highway and the sound of the wind remained. I thought about keeping driving, but something told me I should stay a moment, think things through carefully. I felt like the whole truck was colder, like the temperature had suddenly dropped. I didn't want to turn on the radio. I preferred to listen to anything around me. And then the worst thing happened. The same check load message appeared again, but this time on the windshield. It wasn't written with light. It was like someone had run a finger through the dust on the glass and written it from inside. I froze, gripping the steering wheel with all my strength, unable to move. I don't know how much time passed, but I managed to start the truck and kept driving. I didn't look in the mirrors or back. I didn't want to see anything. I got to a gas station a few hours later, close to my destination. I parked the rig and sat there for a while, trying to understand what had happened. Just then, a trucker who was there came up to me and told me something that left me cold. That stretch were all that happened to you. They say an 18-wheeler flipped there years ago. The driver died because the load came down on top of him, and since then, those who don't check their load on that straight stretch have accidents. They say the driver's still there, making sure nobody makes the same mistake he did. I didn't answer anything. I just nodded and left. Since that day, I check my truck before, during, and after every trip. I don't know what I saw, but something or someone saved me that night, or at least that's what I want to believe. My name is Marcus, and I've been driving long-haul trucks across the Midwest for about 17 years now. In all that time, I've seen plenty of things that most people would find hard to believe. But there's one incident that happened a few winters ago that still keeps me awake some nights, and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I was hauling freight through northern Wisconsin, making my way toward the Minnesota border. It was my third day on the road, and I was running behind schedule due to some unexpected delays at the loading dock. The snow had been falling steadily since I left Chicago, and by the time I hit the back roads, it was coming down hard enough to slow traffic to a crawl. Around 2 a.m, exhaustion finally caught up with me. My eyelids felt like lead weights, and I knew I had to find somewhere safe to pull over before I became a danger to myself and everyone else on the road. That's when I spotted what looked like an old truck stop off Highway 53. The place seemed abandoned. No lights in the windows, snow piled high around the gas pumps, and not another vehicle in sight. Perfect, I thought. Nobody would bother me there, and I could catch a few hours of sleep in peace. I pulled my rig around to the back of the building, away from the highway, and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of road noise. I crawled into the sleeper berth, pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin, and was out cold within minutes. I'd guess I'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours when something woke me up. At first, I thought it might have been the wind. It had been howling pretty fierce when I stopped. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a child crying. The sound sent ice through my veins. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sobbing and calling for help. Her voice carried clearly through the storm, cutting through the howling wind like a knife. I sat up in my bunk, my heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell was a kid doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a blizzard? I climbed into the driver's seat and peered out through the windshield. But the snow was coming down so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The crying continued, seeming to come from the woods behind the truck stop. It was heartbreaking, this desperate, terrified sobbing that no child should ever have to make. I grabbed my heavy coat and pulled it on, my mind racing. This could be a kidnapping situation. Maybe someone had grabbed a kid and dumped her out here. Or maybe a family had been in an accident somewhere nearby. Either way, I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind was savage, driving snow into my eyes and making it almost impossible to see. But I could still hear her, that pitiful crying coming from somewhere in the tree line behind the building. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, then started making my way toward the sound. The snow was knee-deep in places, and more than once I stumbled over hidden debris or fallen branches. But I kept going, following that heartbreaking voice deeper into the woods. The strangest thing was, as I got closer to where the crying seemed to be coming from, my body started reacting in ways I'd never experienced before. A bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled into my bones. My legs felt weak, almost shaky, and this weird pain started spreading across my lower back, something I'd never dealt with before. It was like my body was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I ignored it. Some kid was in trouble, and I wasn't about to abandon her. I'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I realized something was wrong. The crying seemed to be coming from right next to me now, so close I should have been able to reach out and touch whoever was making it. But my flashlight beam revealed nothing but snow-covered trees and empty forest. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening. The crying was definitely coming from somewhere very close by, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. It seemed to be moving around me, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, sometimes almost directly overhead. And then, just like that, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no rustling branches, no distant highway noise. Just me standing alone in the middle of a dark forest, with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the weak beam of my phone's flashlight cutting through the falling snow. That's when I heard the laughter. It started low, almost like a chuckle, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it. It was the laugh of an old woman, bitter and malicious, filled with a kind of cruel amusement that made my skin crawl. And it was coming from directly above me. I looked up and my blood turned to ice. There, hanging upside down from the branch of an oak tree about 10 feet over my head, was an elderly woman. Her legs were wrapped around the thick branch, supporting her weight, while her long, gray hair hung down almost to my eye level. She was swaying back and forth slightly, like she was on some kind of twisted playground swing, and that horrible laughter was pouring out of her mouth. Her eyes were fixed on mine, and even in the dim light of my phone, I could see the malevolent intelligence there. She knew exactly what she'd been doing, luring me out here with the sound of a crying child. And now she was enjoying my terror. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run. 1 second I was standing there, frozen with shock, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my coat and snow flying up around me as I fought my way back toward the truck stop. Behind me, that awful laughter continued, seeming to follow me through the trees. When I finally broke out of the woods and saw my truck sitting there in the parking lot, I nearly cried with relief. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it, and hauled myself up into the cab. The engine turned over on the first try, and I threw the transmission into gear without even letting it warm up. I pulled out of that parking lot so fast I nearly jackknifed the trailer. And if there had been any other traffic on the highway, I probably would have caused a major accident. My whole body was shaking as I drove, adrenaline and terror coursing through my system like electricity. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop about 40 miles down the road. Even then, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, engine running, trying to process what had just happened. Of course, there's no rational explanation for what I experienced that night. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. There are things out there in the remote places, things that don't belong in our world, and that night, I had the misfortune of running into one of them. These days, I'm a lot more careful about where I stop for the night. I stick to established truck stops with plenty of lights and other drivers around. And if I ever hear a child crying in the middle of nowhere again, I'll call 911 and let the professionals handle it. Because some situations are just too dangerous for a single person to handle alone. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense, but I've learned that when you're driving the back roads of America at 3 a.m, there are some things you just don't question. I'm talking about places where something feels fundamentally wrong, like the air itself is different, or where time seems to move slower than it should. Most experienced truckers will tell you the same thing. The best advice doesn't come from company manuals. It comes from the warnings passed down in truck stop diners and over CB radio channels. That particular night, I wish I'd listened to those warnings. I'd picked up a load of industrial equipment in Detroit, the kind of freight that insurance companies pay top dollar to protect. The route was supposed to take me straight down Interstate 75, but I'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, and my eyes were starting to burn. Company policy said I needed to find an approved rest area, but fatigue was winning the battle against common sense. When I saw a sign for a gas station at the next exit, I figured it didn't matter where I stopped as long as I got some sleep. The exit ramp led me down a winding road that seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, past rusted mailboxes and overgrown ditches that looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in years. The gas station, when I finally reached it, looked like something out of the 1970s. A single pump stood under a flickering canopy light, next to a small convenience store with windows so grimy I couldn't see inside. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no signs of life except for the neon beer signs glowing weakly in the store windows. The whole place felt wrong somehow, but exhaustion was clouding my judgment. I pulled my rig into the far corner of the lot, killed the engine, and climbed down to stretch my legs. The air smelled stale, like it had been sitting motionless for hours. Inside the store, a thin man with graying hair sat behind the counter, staring at a small television that seemed to be playing nothing but static. The shelves were stocked with dusty merchandise that looked like it had been sitting there for months. I grabbed a bottle of water and a package of beef jerky, more out of habit than hunger. When I approached the counter, the clerk barely looked up from his screen. He mumbled the total without making eye contact, and I paid in cash, eager to get back outside and away from the oppressive atmosphere of the store. That's when I noticed the other trucker. He was standing beside an ancient Peterbilt on the far side of the lot, wearing dark coveralls that had seen better days. What struck me as odd was that he wasn't doing anything, not checking his load, not inspecting his tires, not even smoking a cigarette. He was just standing there, perfectly still, with his head tilted slightly in my direction. In the dim light from the store, I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I had the distinct impression he was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I decided it was time to get some sleep and get the hell out of there first thing in the morning. I climbed back into my cab, locked the doors, and settled into the sleeper berth. Outside, the only sound was the distant hum of the highway and the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting in the cool night air. Despite my unease, exhaustion took over within minutes. I have no idea how long I'd been asleep when the knocking started. It wasn't a gentle tap or an accidental bump. Someone was deliberately striking the side of my cab with what sounded like a metal tool, creating a steady rhythm that cut through my dreams like an alarm clock. I sat up in the darkness, my heart already racing. The knocking continued, 3 sharp strikes, a pause, then 3 more strikes. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, then cautiously made my way to the driver's seat to peer out the windows. The parking lot was empty. I swept the flashlight beam across the asphalt, checking every shadow and corner, but there was no one there. Even the other trucker and his rig had vanished. The convenience store was dark now, as if it had been closed for hours. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. When I'd parked, there had been lights on throughout the lot, the canopy over the gas pump, the neon signs in the store windows, even a street lamp near the entrance. Now everything was dark except for the beam of my own flashlight. The knocking started again, this time closer to the front of the cab. I held my breath and listened, trying to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Then I heard something that nearly stopped my heart. A voice, low and urgent, spoke a single word just outside my driver's side window. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I fired up the engine, threw the transmission into gear, and hit the lights. In the sudden glare of my headlights, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing near the store entrance. The same trucker I'd seen earlier, still motionless, still watching. I floored the accelerator and didn't look back until I was on the interstate, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. At the first major truck stop I came to, I pulled in and found another driver who'd been running these routes for years. When I described the place where I'd stopped, his expression grew serious. "You talking about that old Sinclair station off exit 42? He asked. I nodded, and he shook his head grimly. That place has been trouble for years. Used to be a front for a drug operation back in the 80s. They'd hijack trucks, steal the cargo, sometimes worse. Drivers who stopped there alone had a way of disappearing. My mouth went dry. What happened to them? Nobody knows for sure. The DEA raided the place eventually, but they never found any bodies, never made any arrests. The owner just vanished one night, left everything behind. But the stories kept coming from drivers who'd stopped there without knowing the history. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. They say there's still someone there, someone who tries to warn truckers away. A driver named Bobby Hutchins went missing there in '87, never found his body. Word is, if you're lucky, you just see him standing there watching. But if he knocks on your door, what does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew. Means you're in real danger. Means whatever's still operating out of that place has noticed you, and you need to get gone before they decide you're worth the trouble. I never found out what would have happened if I'd ignored that warning and stayed, and I never want to find out. These days I stick to company-approved stops, even if it means driving a few extra miles. I follow the recommended routes, and when other drivers warn me about a particular stretch of road or a certain exit, I listen. Because sometimes the dead are trying to help the living. And sometimes, if you're smart enough to pay attention, they might just save your life. People always ask me about the strangest thing I've encountered in 23 years of long-haul trucking. They expect stories about drunk drivers or police chases, maybe severe weather or mechanical breakdowns. But the truth is, the strangest thing that ever happened to me occurred on a stretch of highway that, according to every map and GPS system I've checked since, doesn't exist. I was making my first solo run from Portland to Denver, hauling computer equipment for a tech company. It was October, and I was taking Interstate 84 through Oregon when I decided to try a shortcut that a more experienced driver had mentioned at a truck stop in Pendleton. He'd said there was a state route that would shave about 40 miles off my trip. And as a rookie trying to make a good impression, I figured every advantage counted. The turnoff was exactly where he'd said it would be, a barely visible road sign pointing toward State Route 217. The highway was narrow but well maintained, cutting through dense forest that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt normal. I passed a few other vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and the occasional car, and the GPS on my dashboard showed me making good time. Then things started to get weird. The first sign that something was wrong came when I glanced at my watch. I could have sworn it was just past 9 o'clock when I turned onto the state route, but now it was reading 8:55. I figured I'd misread it earlier. Night driving can play tricks on your perception of time. But then I looked again 10 minutes later, and it still read 8:55. I tapped the crystal with my finger, thinking maybe the mechanism was stuck, but the second hand was moving normally. It was like time itself had decided to take a break along this particular stretch of road. That's when my GPS started acting up. The screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black. I tried resetting it, unplugging it, and plugging it back in, but nothing worked. According to my navigation system, I was driving through empty space. A few minutes later, my CB radio began picking up static. I tried switching channels, but every frequency was filled with the same white noise, punctuated occasionally by what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I turned the volume down and focused on the road ahead. The highway stretched on endlessly, cutting through forests so thick and dark that my headlights seemed to barely penetrate them. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, which struck me as odd for a state route that was supposed to be a popular shortcut. Then my engine began to sputter. I felt the truck losing power, saw the dashboard lights flickering like they were running on a dying battery. I managed to pull over to the shoulder just as the engine died completely, leaving me sitting in total darkness except for the weak glow of my emergency flashers. I climbed down from the cab and popped the hood, expecting to find a loose connection or maybe a blown fuse. But everything looked normal under the hood. No obvious signs of mechanical failure, no strange smells or sounds. When I looked up from the engine compartment, I saw something that made my heart stop. On the other side of the highway, parked in the exact same position as my truck, was an identical Freightliner. Same model, same color, even the same company logo on the door. But that wasn't the part that scared me. The part that scared me was seeing myself sitting in the driver's seat. It wasn't a similar-looking driver or someone who happened to resemble me. It was me, same jacket, same baseball cap, same confused expression I could feel on my own face. The other me was looking back at me with the same mixture of shock and disbelief that I was experiencing. We stared at each other across that empty highway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I wanted to call out, to wave, to do something to confirm that what I was seeing was real, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me. Then my radio crackled to life. The static cut out instantly, replaced by perfect silence, as if someone had thrown a switch somewhere in the universe. The sudden change in sound made me blink instinctively, and when I opened my eyes again, the other truck was gone. The highway was empty again. My engine turned over without hesitation, and according to my GPS, which was suddenly working perfectly, I was 30 miles further down the road than I'd thought possible. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I checked my logbook later, there was no record of the time I'd spent on State Route 217. According to my GPS history and my delivery schedule, I'd taken the normal route along Interstate 84. I never found State Route 217 on any map, official or otherwise. I've asked other drivers about it, described the turnoff and the surrounding landmarks, but nobody has ever heard of such a road. The shortcut that veteran trucker had told me about simply doesn't exist. At least, not in any version of reality that I understand. Since then, I've made it a rule to stick to major highways and well-documented routes. I don't take shortcuts suggested by strangers, and I certainly don't venture onto roads that aren't clearly marked on current maps. Because somewhere out there, on highways that exist in the spaces between our world and wherever else, there are versions of ourselves making the same journey, asking the same questions, and wondering why they can't find their way home. I never want to meet myself again on a road that doesn't exist. And I pray that other version of me found his way back to the real world, because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. My name is David Chen, and I've been hauling construction materials across the Southwest for the better part of 8 years. It's honest work that pays the bills, and I genuinely love being on the open road. The only things that really bother me about this job are the occasional run-ins with highway patrol and the strange incidents that seem to happen when you're driving through the middle of nowhere at 4 in the morning. What I'm about to tell you happened in March, during one of the worst storm seasons Arizona had seen in years. I was heading north on Highway 87, carrying a load of rebar destined for a construction site outside Flagstaff. The Weather Service had been broadcasting severe thunderstorm warnings all afternoon, and by the time the sun went down, the rain was coming down in sheets. I'd been driving since noon, taking my time due to the conditions, when the storm really started to intensify. The wind was strong enough to rock my truck, and the rain was so heavy that even with my wipers on high speed, I could barely see the road ahead. I'd slowed to about 30 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, just trying to keep the truck between the ditches. It was a little past 4 in the morning when she appeared. One second the road ahead was empty, and the next second there was a woman standing directly in my path. She was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, soaked through from the rain, and she just stood there in the middle of the highway like she was waiting for something. I hit the brakes as hard as I dared on the wet pavement, feeling the truck start to slide despite my best efforts to maintain control. There was no way I could stop in time. At the speed I was traveling, even reduced for the weather, the impact was inevitable. I felt the sickening thud as the front bumper struck her, saw her body disappear beneath the cab. The truck shuddered to a stop, and I sat there for a moment in complete shock, rain hammering against the windshield and my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my emergency flashlight, threw on my rain gear, and climbed down into the storm. The highway was lit by my headlights and emergency flashers, creating an eerie strobe effect in the driving rain. I ran to the front of the truck, expecting to find the worst possible scene, but there was nothing there. No body, no blood, no evidence that I'd hit anything at all. I searched under the truck, thinking maybe she'd been thrown clear, and was lying injured in the darkness beyond my lights. I walked both sides of the highway for a quarter mile in each direction, calling out, asking if anyone could hear me. But there was nothing except the sound of rain and wind. I called 911 from my cell phone, though the signal was weak in that remote area. The dispatcher said it would take at least 2 hours for emergency responders to reach me, given the weather conditions and my location. She instructed me to stay put and keep my hazard lights on. Those 2 hours felt like the longest of my life. I sat in my cab, watching the rain run down the windshield, replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind. I knew what I'd experienced. I'd seen that woman clear as day, felt the impact when I hit her. But without any physical evidence, I was starting to doubt my own memory. When the state trooper finally arrived, followed by an ambulance, we conducted an even more thorough search of the area. The rain had stopped by then, making it easier to see, but we found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no signs that anyone had been on that stretch of highway. The trooper asked me the usual questions. Had I been drinking? Was I taking any medications? How many hours had I been driving? I answered honestly, submitted to a field sobriety test, and let them search my truck. Everything came back clean. The officer was polite but clearly skeptical. He told me that fatigue and weather conditions could cause hallucinations, that the mind sometimes creates images to fill in gaps in perception. I didn't argue with him, but I knew what I'd seen wasn't a hallucination. After they released me, I continued north to complete my delivery. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished back on that highway. 2 days later, on my return trip, I found myself taking the same route, driving slowly past the spot where the incident had occurred. That's when I saw the memorial. About 50 yards off the highway, barely visible through a cluster of mesquite trees, was a small white cross. I pulled over and walked through the brush to get a closer look. The cross was weathered and old, obviously handmade, with a name painted in fading letters across the horizontal beam. Sarah Martinez. Below the name was a date, the same date as my encounter, but 5 years earlier. At the base of the cross were the remains of flowers and candles, long since destroyed by weather and time. But what caught my attention was a small metal plaque, corroded by years of exposure to the elements. I had to kneel down and wipe away the dirt to read it clearly. The plaque told the story of a 26-year-old woman who had been killed in a hit-and-run accident at this exact location. She'd been walking along the highway after her car broke down, trying to reach a gas station for help, when an unknown driver struck her and fled the scene. Her body hadn't been found until 3 days later. The date on the plaque was exactly 5 years before my encounter. I sat there in the desert heat, staring at that memorial, and finally understood what had happened. Sarah Martinez had been trying to get my attention, trying to make me stop so her story wouldn't be forgotten. She'd appeared to me on the anniversary of her death, on a night when the weather conditions were similar to those that had led to her tragedy. I drove to the nearest town and bought flowers, candles, and a small American flag. When I returned to the memorial, I cleaned the cross as best I could and arranged the new items around its base. I said a prayer for Sarah Martinez, promised her that someone still remembered what had happened to her, and asked her to find peace. Since that day, whenever my route takes me past that spot on Highway 87, I stop and leave fresh flowers. I've learned that I'm not the only driver who does this. There are often new candles and flowers there, left by other truckers who have heard the story or had their own encounters with Sarah. I never saw her again after that first night, but I like to think she's found the peace she was looking for. And I've made it my mission to keep her memory alive, to make sure that at least one person still cares about what happened to a young woman who died alone on a dark highway 5 years ago. Sometimes the dead don't want revenge or justice. Sometimes they just want to be remembered. I used to run freight between California and Texas, back when I was younger, and thought I could handle anything the road threw at me. This particular story takes place about 6 years ago, during a run from Los Angeles to Houston that should have been routine, but turned into something I still have nightmares about. I was driving through the desert between Phoenix and El Paso when nature called, as it tends to do when you've been drinking truck stop coffee for 12 hours straight. It was around 3 in the morning, and I'd been looking for a decent place to stop for the last hour. Most of the truck stops along that stretch closed their restrooms overnight due to security concerns. So when I saw the neon signs of a 24-hour gas station off exit 118, I didn't hesitate to pull in. The place looked normal enough from the outside, a typical desert gas station with a small convenience store attached. There were a couple of other vehicles in the lot, including a sedan with Texas plates and a motorcycle that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights inside the store were bright enough to hurt my eyes after hours of driving in the dark. When I walked through the front door, I immediately noticed how quiet it was. No background music, no hum of conversation, just the steady drone of the air conditioning system and the buzz of the overhead lights. The place smelled like disinfectant mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unpleasant. I looked around for the clerk, but didn't see anyone behind the counter. The register was closed, and there was no sign indicating that someone would be back soon. I called out hello a couple of times, but got no response. The restroom was at the back of the store, past aisles of snack foods and motor oil. When I tried the door, it was locked. I could hear sounds coming from inside, what sounded like someone moving around, maybe cleaning or doing maintenance work. I knocked and called out that I needed to use the facilities. No answer. I waited for several minutes, growing increasingly uncomfortable. The sounds from inside the restroom continued, scraping noises, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Occasionally, I'd hear what sounded like running water, but it had a strange rhythm to it, starting and stopping at irregular intervals. While I waited, I wandered the aisles, looking for something to drink and maybe some snacks for the road. The merchandise seemed normal enough, though everything had a thin layer of dust on it, like it had been sitting there for months. The refrigerated section was fully stocked, but when I opened one of the cooler doors, the drinks inside were all past their expiration dates. That should have been my first real warning sign, but I was tired and focused on more immediate concerns. I went back to the restroom and knocked again, this time more insistently. The sounds inside stopped immediately, as if whoever was in there had frozen at the sound of my knocking. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door. The lock clicked, and the door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman wearing a gas station uniform shirt. She was Asian, maybe Filipino, with shoulder-length black hair and a smile that seemed forced. There was something about her expression that made me immediately uncomfortable. Her eyes were too bright, too intense, and she was staring at me in a way that felt invasive. "Sorry about that," she said, her voice higher than I'd expected. "I was just fixing a plumbing problem. You can use it now, but be careful, the floor might be a little wet." I thanked her and started to step past her into the restroom, but she moved to block my path slightly. Not enough to prevent me from entering, but enough to make the interaction feel awkward. "You're traveling late," she observed, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Long way from home." Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I mumbled something about being on a delivery schedule and tried again to get past her, but she continued to hover near the doorway. "I'll be right out," I said, hoping she'd take the hint and give me some privacy. She finally stepped aside, but I could feel her watching me as I entered the restroom. I locked the door behind me and immediately understood why she'd warned me about the wet floor. The entire restroom was soaked, not just damp, but actually flooded with several inches of standing water. The water was reddish-brown in color, and there was a metallic smell in the air that made my stomach turn. Whatever plumbing problem she'd been fixing, it had created a serious mess. I decided I could wait until the next stop. When I came back out, the woman was standing behind the counter, still wearing that inappropriate smile. I grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips, more to justify my presence than because I actually wanted them. "That'll be $8.47, she said, though I noticed she never actually rang anything up on the register. I only had a $20 bill, and when I asked for change, she shook her head. "Sorry, the register is locked and I don't have the key. Do you have exact change?" I didn't, and I told her to just keep the items. I'd pay for them elsewhere. But as I started to leave, she called after me. "Wait, you can't just leave without paying. That's stealing." There was something in her tone that made me turn around. She was no longer smiling, and the bright intensity in her eyes had shifted to something that looked almost predatory. "Look, I don't have exact change, and you can't make change," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I'll pay for a bottle of water somewhere else." She stared at me for a long moment. Then suddenly the smile returned. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Consider it on the house. Safe travels." I left the store feeling deeply unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Everything about the interaction had felt wrong. The woman's behavior, the flooded restroom, the expired merchandise, the locked register. I climbed back into my truck and got out of there as quickly as possible. The next morning, I was resting at a truck stop outside El Paso when my phone rang. It was a Texas State Police detective, and he wanted to know if I could come in for questioning. According to him, security cameras had captured my truck at the scene of a homicide. My blood ran cold. I knew immediately which gas station he was talking about. When I arrived at the police station, the detective explained what had happened. The real clerk, a 19-year-old college student named Maria Santos, had been working the night shift when an escaped mental patient named Linda Walsh had entered the store around 2:30 in the morning. Walsh had a history of violent psychotic episodes and had disappeared from a psychiatric facility in Tucson 3 days earlier. According to the security footage, Walsh had attacked Maria with a box cutter, killing her in the store's back office. She had then dragged the body into the restroom, where she had spent nearly an hour dismembering it in the sink and bathtub. The plumbing problem she'd been fixing was actually her attempting to dispose of body parts down the drain. After cleaning up, Walsh had put on Maria's uniform shirt and taken her place behind the counter. The detective showed me screenshots from the security cameras, grainy black and white images that clearly showed the woman I'd spoken to, now identified as Linda Walsh, interacting with me while covered in Maria's blood. The dark stains on her shirt that I'd assumed were grease or dirt had actually been blood. The flooding in the restroom had been caused by her attempts to wash evidence down the drains, which had become clogged with human remains. The strange smell I'd noticed throughout the store had been the smell of death. "You're lucky to be alive," the detective told me. Walsh killed 2 other people before we caught her, a motorist at a rest stop near Lordsburg, and a truck driver who stopped for fuel outside Deming. In both cases, she lured them into isolated areas before attacking. The reason she'd let me go, the detective theorized, was that I'd been too cautious. I hadn't gone into the restroom when she'd wanted me to. I hadn't given her an opportunity to get me alone, and I'd left the store quickly when things felt wrong. She'd decided I wasn't worth the risk. They caught Walsh 18 hours later at another gas station, where she'd killed the overnight clerk and was preparing to take his place when a customer called police after finding blood in the parking lot. She was currently serving multiple life sentences in a maximum security facility. During the trial, I had to testify about my encounter with her. Sitting in that courthouse, looking at Linda Walsh across the room, was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. She looked completely different, medicated, subdued, almost fragile. But I remembered those bright, predatory eyes, and I knew I was looking at someone capable of unimaginable violence. The prosecutor told me later that my testimony had been crucial in establishing her pattern of behavior. The fact that she'd been able to maintain the pretense of being a normal gas station clerk, even while covered in her victim's blood, demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that helped justify the maximum sentences. I quit long-haul trucking 6 months after the trial. The money was good, and I genuinely loved the work, but I couldn't shake the paranoia that had settled over me after that night. Every late-night stop, every interaction with a stranger, every isolated gas station triggered memories of Linda Walsh's smile and those two bright eyes. These days, I work local deliveries, home every night, and I've been seeing a therapist to help process what I experienced. She tells me that survivor's guilt is normal, that it's natural to wonder why I lived when Maria Santos and those other victims didn't. But the truth is, I think I survived because something deep in my brain recognized danger and made me cautious when I might otherwise have been trusting. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if someone seems just a little too interested in getting you alone, don't give them the opportunity. Sometimes the difference between going home to your family and becoming a statistic is nothing more than listening to that little voice in your head that says, something's not right here. Because sometimes, that voice is the only thing standing between you and someone who sees you as their next victim. This story was told to me by my grandmother several years ago, and though time has passed, I can't stop thinking about what my grandfather experienced. Despite being someone who usually listens to stories with healthy skepticism, this particular one has made me reconsider many things. What I'm about to tell you happened 23 years ago, and it was the last time my grandfather ever took a long-haul route. My grandfather had been a trucker his entire life. He was a tough man, accustomed to solitude and the long hours behind the wheel on America's interstate highways. My grandmother always told me he was never easily frightened. Sure, there were times when certain situations made him nervous, but I had never seen him truly scared. At least, that's what I believed until that night in October of 2001. My grandmother told me that my grandfather had left on a delivery run that would take him approximately 5 days total. It was a familiar route from Chicago to Denver, one he had driven countless times before. The first part of the journey went smoothly, but something strange began to happen on the second night when he called my grandmother from a payphone at a small truck stop along Interstate 80 in Nebraska. It was a cold autumn night, and my grandfather, while pulling his jacket tighter around himself, called my grandmother as he usually did during his runs. But on this occasion, his voice didn't sound like it always did. My grandmother told me she noticed it immediately. There was something in his tone, as if he were frightened. He told her that since leaving Chicago, at every stop he made, whether to fuel up, grab coffee, or simply use the restroom, he had noticed a woman. According to my grandfather, this woman never approached him or did anything out of the ordinary. She simply watched him from a distance, hidden in the shadows between the diesel pumps and service buildings, dressed completely in black from head to toe. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, maybe someone else traveling the same route, or perhaps a local resident near one of the truck stops. But when he saw her a second and third time, at different truck stops in towns separated by hundreds of miles, something inside him began to feel uneasy. He could never see her face clearly, but he always knew she was watching him. That sensation of being observed accompanied him at every stop, and although she never made any move to approach or speak to him, her mere presence made him nervous. I remember my grandmother telling me that during that phone call, my grandfather said in a shaky voice, "I don't know who this woman is, but she gives me a really bad feeling. There's something heavy and negative about her presence. I feel something strange when I see her, like something terrible is about to happen." My grandmother, as she always did, tried to calm him down. She told him she would pray for his safety, that it was surely just a coincidence, that maybe he was tired and his mind was playing tricks on him. But my grandfather wasn't convinced. He kept repeating that he didn't feel right, that even though he couldn't see the woman clearly, she emanated an aura that filled him with dread. Never before had my grandmother heard my grandfather speak like that, as if he truly feared this mysterious woman. After a while, my grandmother managed to calm him down somewhat, telling him to get some rest and to arrive safely. My grandfather promised he would, though he still sounded uncertain and troubled. That was the last time my grandmother heard his voice. The following morning, my grandmother was awakened by a phone call. It was the Colorado State Police. They informed her that my grandfather had died in an accident during the early morning hours. My grandmother, in a state of shock, could barely understand what they were telling her. According to the report, my grandfather had lost control of his 18-wheeler on a dangerous curve in the Rocky Mountains, went off the highway, and died instantly. There had been no time to do anything. For my family, his death was a devastating blow. No one expected something like that. My grandfather had always been a careful man with decades of experience, and that route wasn't new to him. However, when my grandmother began to share what my grandfather had told her the night before, many in the family started to believe that the woman who had been following him was not just any ordinary person. Over the years, I've heard many theories about what really happened that night. Some think my grandfather was hallucinating from fatigue, that perhaps his mind was no longer clear, and that led to the accident. But others, like my grandmother and some close family members, firmly believe that the woman watching him was something more. Death herself, perhaps, waiting for the right moment to claim him. When I heard this story for the first time, I couldn't stop imagining my grandfather alone on that dark mountain highway, with that sensation of being stalked. I thought about what he must have felt seeing that figure at every stop, knowing something wasn't right, but being unable to do anything about it. My grandmother always said he felt that woman wasn't normal, and although he could never see her clearly, he knew her presence brought something malevolent. It's easy to dismiss stories like these, to think they're just superstitions or the result of an exhausted mind. But after hearing what my grandfather experienced and how his journey ended, I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, death was searching for him from the beginning. Perhaps that woman dressed in black was a warning, a harbinger of what was about to happen. Today, whenever I see an old payphone at a truck stop along the interstate, I can't help but think about that call, about the fear my grandfather must have felt, and about the figure that watched him from the shadows. I wonder if, somehow, he knew what was going to happen, and if, in his final moments, he understood who that woman was, and why she had been following him across 3 states. It's a story that left me with more questions than answers, but there's one thing I'm certain of. Sometimes death presents itself in ways we don't understand, stalking us without our awareness. And perhaps, as happened to my grandfather, there's no way to escape when death decides it's your time to go. A few years ago, something happened to me that I honestly haven't told many people about. I think partly because I still can't fully understand it myself. But today, I feel it's time to share it, because I know there are things that simply have no explanation. It was a regular Tuesday night in March. I had left Phoenix early that afternoon, carrying a load that needed to be delivered to a small town several hours away in New Mexico. The trip was going well. The highway was quiet, the weather was clear, and although night runs always make me a bit tense, I felt calm. I had a few more hours before reaching my destination, so I decided to stop at a small truck stop on the outskirts of a desert town to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. While walking back to my rig, I encountered someone I didn't expect to see. It was Marcus, a friend of mine from childhood. Seeing him there, I couldn't help but be surprised. He was standing next to the fuel pumps, leaning against a concrete barrier, staring at the ground. The first thing that caught my attention was his appearance. He looked extremely tired, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were sunken, and his clothes were wrinkled and dirty. The strangest thing was that he said nothing when I approached him. I spoke to Marcus with a smile, telling him I didn't expect to see him there, but he didn't respond. He just glanced at me sideways without lifting his head. Something wasn't right with his gaze. It wasn't the look of someone who recognized a friend. There was something in his expression that deeply disturbed me, but I didn't want to press. Maybe he was going through a rough time, so I offered him a ride. "Come on, Marcus. I'll take you wherever you're going," I said, and after a few seconds, he slowly moved toward the passenger door of the truck and climbed in. During the first few minutes of the drive, I tried to start a conversation. I asked him how he was, what he was doing out there, if everything was okay. But Marcus said nothing. He just stared straight ahead with the same expression of anguish on his face. Every now and then he would let out a deep sigh, as if carrying a tremendous weight, but he wouldn't say what was wrong. I decided to let him be with his thoughts. I figured maybe he needed some space to process whatever he was going through, but honestly, the situation was making me increasingly nervous. After a few miles, I received a phone call. What happened next still gives me chills to think about. The phone rang, and without thinking much about it, I answered. It was the voice of a woman on the other end, and I recognized her immediately. It was Sarah, Marcus's sister. "Is this really you?" she said, her voice breaking. "Listen, I need you to know something. Marcus was in an accident a few hours ago. They found him near the state line, but he didn't make it." In that instant, the world seemed to stop. I couldn't understand what I was hearing. I told her what was she talking about. Marcus was sitting right next to me. I glanced at my passenger, who was still sitting in the same place in silence. But something was wrong, very wrong. When I turned my head completely toward him, what I saw left me frozen. Marcus's face, or what had been his face, had changed completely. His skin had become distorted. His mouth was twisted in a grimace of indescribable suffering, and his eyes were filled with a desperation that wasn't human. He was trying to say something, moving his lips as if he wanted to speak, but from his mouth came only guttural sounds, a kind of agonizing moans that showed tremendous suffering. It wasn't a voice. These were failed attempts to scream, to call for help, but without words. The sensation of terror I felt in that moment is something I will never be able to forget. My heart raced, and without thinking, I let go of the steering wheel for a second, and that was the worst mistake I could have made. The truck lost control, and before I knew it, we were heading directly toward a cluster of Joshua trees on the side of the highway. Everything happened so fast that I didn't have time to react. The impact was brutal, and the last thing I remember is the deafening sound of metal twisting and glass shattering. When I woke up, I was surrounded by state troopers and paramedics. My head hurt like never before, and I didn't understand what had happened. The first thing I did was ask about Marcus. I asked them urgently, trying to get up, but one of the paramedics stopped me. "Sir, you were alone when we arrived. There was no one else in the cab." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain to them that I had picked up Marcus, that he had been with me the entire time, but their expressions said it all. They didn't believe me. They searched the entire truck, looked around the area, but they found no one. It was just me, trapped between the steering wheel and the seat with some injuries, but alive. Days passed before I could finally leave the hospital. No one in Marcus's family understood how it was possible that I had seen him that night when he had already been dead for hours. His accident had occurred before I found him at the truck stop. They said he was last seen alive in the afternoon before he disappeared, and all of this keeps echoing in my head. If Marcus had died earlier, who did I pick up that night? Who did I carry with me in the truck? Years have passed since then, and although I try to continue with my life, that night never leaves my mind. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was really my friend or something that took his form. The only thing I know is that, whatever it was, it didn't belong to this world. And although he's no longer here to tell me, I feel that somehow Marcus was asking for help, but I couldn't understand it until it was too late. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through that same stretch of desert highway, I find myself checking the passenger seat, making sure it's empty. Because deep down, I'm afraid that one day I might see him again, still trying to tell me something I'll never be able to understand. My name is Mario, and I've been behind the wheel for over 30 years, traveling routes of all kinds, from endless interstates to dusty back roads in the middle of nowhere. I'm not afraid of long hours, the solitude of the highway, or the ghost stories you hear at every truck stop. The trucker's life teaches you to keep your feet on the ground. But that night in late November, that night was different, and I still don't know if what I experienced was real. It all began on a particularly difficult day. Business wasn't good. The company I worked for had been having financial problems for months, and they had already laid off several drivers. I knew my time was running out. Bills were piling up, and the bank had sent me a warning letter about my house. I was facing losing everything. So when they called me to offer a last-minute job, I accepted without thinking too much about it. It was quick money and double the normal rate. The client, a man with a calm but mysterious voice, told me he had a load that needed to be urgently transported to a warehouse deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. The only strange detail was that he wouldn't give me much information about the cargo. He just told me it was fragile and that I had to deliver it before dawn. What caught my attention most was the final warning: don't open the trailer under any circumstances. Don't ask what it is, just carry the load and collect your pay. In any other situation, I would have said no. The job smelled like trouble, and I knew something wasn't right. But I was desperate. I needed that money like never before, so I convinced myself it wasn't my business what I was carrying in the trailer. The pay was too good, and in this business, sometimes it's better not to ask questions. I picked up the truck at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore, a place that already gave me bad vibes. The client, a tall, thin man, was waiting for me with a smile that made me uncomfortable, as if he knew something I didn't. He gave me an envelope with half the payment in advance and indicated the route. Remember, don't open the trailer and don't stop more than necessary. Just follow the road. I left shortly before midnight. At first, everything seemed normal. It was a lonely route, like many others I had driven in my life, and night traffic was sparse. But as I progressed along the winding mountain highway, I began to notice something strange. A faint noise was coming from the trailer. At first, I thought it was the natural movement of the cargo. But as time passed, the noises became more persistent. It was as if something inside the trailer was scratching the walls, trying to get out. I forced myself not to think about it. I knew that if I stopped or tried to inspect, I would break the agreement, so I kept driving, although a strange sensation began to grow in my stomach. I was alone on a dark road with a load I knew nothing about, and the air inside the cab felt heavy. It seemed like the cold was seeping into my bones, despite the heater running full blast. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought they were effects of the wind seeping through some crack in the truck. But no, those murmurs seemed like words I couldn't quite understand, but that echoed in my head as if someone were speaking very close to me, almost in my ear. The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, something that didn't sound entirely human. A couple of hours later, I decided to stop at a truck stop. I needed coffee to stay awake. Besides, the noises from the trailer had become more intense, soft, rhythmic knocks, as if something inside was calling for my attention. While I was fueling up, I couldn't help but take a look at the trailer. It seemed normal from the outside, but that strange sensation wouldn't leave me alone. I went into the store to buy coffee, and the cashier, an older man, looked at me in a way that left me very worried. "You coming from that direction?" he asked, pointing to the road I had come from. I nodded, trying not to seem nervous. "Be careful, son," he said. "That road doesn't always lead only where one thinks it does." I thanked him, although his words left me more uneasy than I already was. I returned to the truck, started the engine, and continued on my way, but the noises from the trailer wouldn't stop. The cold inside the cab was getting worse, and the whispers were becoming clearer. I didn't understand the words, but I could feel the unease in the air, an anguish that was truly suffering. It wasn't until I reached a particularly sharp curve that the strangest thing happened. The truck's lights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw a shadow pass in front of the headlights. Someone or something was on the road. I slammed on the brakes, terrified, and sat motionless, staring ahead, but there was nothing. Just the dark asphalt and the shadows of the pine trees. I shook my head, trying to concentrate. I must have been tired, exhausted from the tension of the entire trip. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that will stay in my mind for the rest of my life. At the back of the trailer, just at the edge of my vision, a dark figure seemed to be watching me. I couldn't make out details, but that presence was there, motionless, as if waiting for me to do something. I don't know how long I stayed looking at it, but when I finally had the courage to turn around to look directly, it disappeared. The sensation that something was stalking me was stronger now. The noises inside the trailer had become a nightmare to listen to. They were no longer just knocks. They were like footsteps, moving from one side to the other. And underneath it all, those whispers that seemed to be calling my name, though I had never told anyone in this job what it was. When I finally reached the warehouse, an old, half-collapsed building in the middle of the mountains, I felt a strange relief. I wanted to get rid of that load as soon as possible. The same man who had hired me was waiting for me, smiling again with that expression that made me feel uncomfortable. "Did you hear her?" he asked without stopping smiling. I froze because I hadn't told him anything about the noises. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to seem indifferent. "The trailer. She sometimes gets restless on long trips." "She?" I asked. The man simply kept smiling and handed me the rest of the payment without saying more. I didn't want to ask any more. I didn't want to know more. I got in the truck and left that place as fast as I could. When I left that warehouse, I felt a mixture of relief and anguish. I had done my job, collected my money, and everything should have been fine, but it wasn't. That trip left me with something more than pay and a bad experience. During the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the trailer noises, the whispers I heard during the journey, and especially that figure I saw through the mirror, that shadow watching me from the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore it. I wanted to convince myself it had just been a hallucination, that my mind was confusing me from fatigue. But then strange things began to happen. At night in my house, I could hear those same knocks I heard in the trailer. Sometimes when I turned off the lights, I felt a presence in the room, as if someone were watching me from the darkness. The worst was one night while I was washing my face in the bathroom. I looked up at the mirror, and for a second, I saw something behind me. A dark figure, motionless, exactly like the one I had seen on the road. I didn't want to look again. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and when I opened them, it was gone. But the fear, that sensation that something wasn't right, hasn't left me since then. I know it sounds crazy, but I have the impression that whatever was in that trailer didn't stay in the mountains. Something malevolent came back with me. Since that trip, I've rejected all suspicious offers, no matter how tempting they seem. Money isn't everything, especially when you feel like something is following you everywhere. Maybe what I carried that night wasn't just illegal merchandise or simple contraband. Maybe, without knowing it, I became the transporter of something much darker, something that doesn't belong to this world. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear those whispers calling my name, reminding me that some cargo should never be carried, no matter how much they pay you. My name is Carlos, and I've been working as a trucker for over 15 years. Throughout all these years, I've traveled hundreds of routes, some longer than others, but I've always enjoyed the tranquility of being alone on the road. I was never a person who got carried away by ghost stories or strange things. But what happened to me on one of my trips, I can't get out of my head. This was about 4 months ago, on one of the routes I know best, Interstate 40 from Little Rock, Arkansas to Oklahoma City. I left Little Rock heading west, a journey that under good conditions takes you about 5 or 6 hours. As always, I preferred to leave at night to avoid traffic, so it was around 10:30 at night when I started my trip. The weather was fine, not too hot or cold, and the highway was clear. Everything was normal. After driving for a good while, already past midnight, I began to feel a discomfort that I couldn't explain. It was like a sensation in my chest, a slight uneasiness, but one that was making me nervous for no reason. The road was empty, as always at those hours, and the cab of my rig was the only place where I could be calm. But that night something didn't feel right. I decided to make a stop at one of those small rest areas along the interstate. There was no one there, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. I parked, turned off the engine, and got out to stretch my legs. The silence was absolute, and when I say absolute, I mean you couldn't hear the slightest sound. Not the crickets, not the wind, nothing. It was just me, standing next to my truck in the middle of nowhere, with that strange sensation that wouldn't let go of me. I told myself that maybe I was tired, that it was nothing, and that I should continue on my way. I got back in the rig, started the engine, and took off. But from the moment I got back on the highway, something began to happen. At first, I thought it was a problem with the dashboard lights, because the indicators were flickering very subtly. It wasn't a strong flicker, but I noticed they weren't staying static like always. They seemed to tremble, almost imperceptibly, but enough to catch my attention. The strange thing was that everything else in the truck was working fine. The lights, the engine, everything was in order. But that detail with the dashboard made me more uncomfortable than it should have. I tried not to give it importance and focused on driving. The road was dark and deserted, as always at those hours, but something in the air felt different. By that point, I was quite uneasy, although I didn't understand why. A few minutes passed, and then the worst part began. Suddenly, I heard a very low noise coming from the radio. It wasn't music or interference, but something that seemed like a whisper. The strange thing was that the radio was turned off. Even so, the whisper continued, as if someone were talking, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. It was so faint that at first I thought it was my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the sound didn't disappear. I changed the station, even though the radio was off, just to see if it would stop, but nothing. The whisper continued. It was annoying because, although I could barely hear it, I knew it was there. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more present it became. The voices seemed to be getting clearer, though I still couldn't make out individual words. I started to get nervous. The dashboard kept flickering slightly, and now the sound on the radio was driving me crazy. I convinced myself that I should stop at the next service station to check what was happening, because this wasn't normal. While I kept driving, I noticed something else. I began to smell wet earth inside the cab. At first, I thought maybe there was a puddle somewhere or that it had rained on some stretch of the highway, but the weather was dry. It didn't make sense. The smell was strong, like it had just rained heavily, but there was no sign of water outside. I looked out the window, and the Oklahoma plains stretched out dry, as always. The smell of wet earth was as strange as the whisper on the radio. It wasn't an unpleasant odor, but it shouldn't have been there. The air conditioning was off, the windows were closed. There was no way for that smell to get into the cab, but there it was. Finally, after driving a while longer with the feeling that something was following me, I arrived at a truck stop. I parked next to two other rigs and turned off the engine, hoping everything would return to normal. But when the engine stopped, the silence was total again. Like at the previous stop, you couldn't hear absolutely anything. I decided to get out of the truck and went to the store to buy some coffee. Inside was only the attendant, an older man who had seen me other times. He asked me if everything was okay, and I don't know why, but I mentioned the smell of wet earth to him. The old man looked at me for a second, as if he knew something I didn't, and without changing his expression, he told me, "That happens sometimes around here. A long time ago, there was a mudslide near this area. Several cars were buried, and they say they never got them all out." I didn't know what to say. I paid for the coffee and left the store, feeling a chill run down my spine. I stayed outside smoking a cigarette, looking at my rig as if I expected something stranger to happen, but nothing did. The whisper on the radio had disappeared, and the smell of wet earth had dissipated. But the feeling that something wasn't right was still there. That night, for the first time in years, I decided to sleep with the windows closed and the door securely locked. I lay down in the sleeper berth, and although I was tired, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear that whisper again, though I knew it wasn't real. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts, but I also can't deny what I felt. And although I've passed through that route many times since then, I never stopped at that rest area again. And I never heard that whisper again. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night through that same stretch of Interstate 40, I find myself turning up the radio volume, just to make sure I don't hear anything I shouldn't. Because deep down I'm afraid that one night, those voices might return, and this time they might have something more to say. My name is Robert, and I've been driving trucks for over 20 years. I've traveled the highways of America from coast to coast, and although you get used to all kinds of strange situations on the road, what happened to me a few months ago left me shaken. Even now, when I remember it, I feel a chill down my spine. It was a September night, around 1 in the morning. I had left San Francisco with a destination of Los Angeles, and as almost always, I was traveling alone. I decided to take Highway 101, one of those routes that almost no one uses at night because it cuts through some remote areas of Central California. It wasn't the first time I had taken that road, but it wasn't my favorite route either. The highway is lonely and full of curves. During the day it doesn't seem so bad, but at night, when there are no lights other than those from your truck, things change. Everything was going normally at first. I was driving calmly, listening to talk radio to stay awake, when suddenly, on one of the sharper curves, I saw something on the shoulder of the highway. At first, I thought it was an animal or a shadow, but when I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man standing on the side of the road, as if he were waiting for someone or something. I didn't pay much attention to him. I thought it was someone who had broken down and was maybe waiting for a ride or a bus. It's not unusual to see people on highways at night, but what seemed strange to me was that the man wasn't moving or raising his hand to ask for help. He was just standing there, looking straight ahead, as if he didn't care that I was passing by. I left him behind and kept driving, but something about that image left me uneasy. I don't know, it was the way he was standing, completely still, as if he weren't real. Even so, I told myself I had no reason to worry, that he was just some random guy. About 10 or 15 minutes passed, and when I reached another sharp curve, there he was again. The same man, standing exactly the same way, in the same posture, on the shoulder of the highway. My heart started beating fast. It was impossible for it to be the same person. There was no way he could have gotten there so quickly. I thought I was confused, that maybe it was two men who looked very similar, but it was too much of a coincidence. I continued on my way, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him again, though I knew I wouldn't. The atmosphere inside the cab was tense, as if something was about to happen at any moment. A few miles ahead, on an even sharper curve, I saw him again. This time he was in the middle of the road. I had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting him. My heart jumped to my throat because the man didn't move. He was standing there looking at me, or so I thought, because I couldn't see his face clearly. The truck's headlights illuminated him, but his face was in shadows. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there without moving, as if he knew I wouldn't dare to keep going. I sat paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. Should I get out? Ask him if he needed something? But part of me was telling me it wasn't a good idea. Something about that person wasn't normal. After what seemed like an eternity, the man took a step toward the shoulder of the road, as if giving me permission to pass. I didn't stay there to think about it and accelerated, leaving him behind, with my heart pounding at 1,000 miles per hour. I no longer knew if what I had just seen was a real person, or if I had really just seen a spirit. But what disturbed me most was that I couldn't stop thinking about his face, or rather, the lack of it, because no matter how hard I tried, I could never see his face clearly. I kept driving without stopping until I saw a truck stop on the road. I decided to stop because I needed to rest, clear my head, and try to understand what had happened. I got out of the truck and went to buy some coffee. Inside the store was the attendant, a man about 50 years old who greeted me as if he had known me all his life. We started talking, and without thinking much about it, I told him what had happened to me. He listened to me in silence, and when I finished, he looked at me seriously. "You're not the first one to see him," he told me. "They say that man was hit by a truck years ago, right on one of those curves. He appears to truckers who pass through there at night. Some say it's to warn them to slow down and not suffer what he experienced. But others say that's not the spirit of that deceased person, but something else pretending to be him." I stayed silent. I didn't know what to respond. The man just gave me a pat on the shoulder and went to the counter, as if what he had told me was the most normal thing in the world. I finished my coffee quickly and returned to the truck, feeling a cold down my back that didn't leave me all night. Since then, every time I have to take that highway, I do it during the day. But when I have no choice and have to drive at night, I slow down at every curve, expecting not to see that figure again. Sometimes glancing in the mirrors, I think I notice a shadow moving behind me, but knowing that when I turn around, there will be no one there. I don't know if what I saw was real, or if my mind played a trick on me from fatigue. But what I do know is that, since that night, I can't drive on that highway without feeling like something is watching me. The strangest part happened about a month later. I was hauling a load from Sacramento to Bakersfield, and I had to take the same route again. This time it was during the day, so I felt more confident. But as I approached the area where I had seen the figure, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, right at the spot where I had seen the man for the third time, where he had stood in the middle of the road, there was a small memorial. I pulled over and walked up to it. It was a simple white cross with some faded plastic flowers around it. The paint was weathered and old, but I could make out a name and a date. The accident had happened 12 years ago. As I stood there reading the inscription, an elderly woman approached from a small house I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind some eucalyptus trees. She had been tending to the flowers at the memorial. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked without any introduction. I nodded, not sure what to say. "That was my son," she continued, her voice steady but sad. "He was walking home from work one night when a drunk driver hit him right here. The driver never stopped." She paused, looking at the cross. "But here's the thing, my boy never walked this road. He always took the bus. I don't know why he was walking that night, but something must have made him change his routine." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and something else, maybe fear. "The truckers who see him," she said, "they always tell me the same thing. That his face was hidden in shadows, that he seemed to be warning them about something. But I know my son's face and what they describe. That's not him." A chill ran down my spine as she continued. "I think something else uses this place, something that feeds on the tragedy that happened here. My son is at rest, I know that much. But whatever appears to you drivers at night, that's something different. Something that doesn't want you to leave this stretch of road alive." I thanked her for sharing her story and got back in my truck, but her words stayed with me. As I drove away, I kept thinking about what she had said. If it wasn't really her son appearing to truckers, then what was it? And why did it always appear in the same spots, as if it were herding drivers towards something? That night, I made a decision. I would never drive that stretch of Highway 101 at night again, no matter what load I was carrying or how much money was involved. Some routes are just too dangerous, not because of the curves or the weather, but because of things that exist in the spaces between our world and whatever lies beyond. But sometimes, even now, when I'm driving other highways late at night, I find myself checking the mirrors more often than I should. Because deep down, I worry that whatever I encountered on that lonely stretch of California highway wasn't confined to just that one place. And maybe, just maybe, it followed me home. Good evening. My name is Octavio, and I've been working as a trucker for many years. I've traveled so many highways across America that I almost know them by heart. What I like most about this job is that I can be alone, think while I drive, and enjoy the silence of the night. I'm not a guy who believes in strange things or ghost stories, although, being honest, I've heard several here and there. I've always been more of a feet-on-the-ground type, until one night something happened to me that I can't forget. It was a regular dawn like any other when I had to make the run from Dallas to San Antonio. I already knew the road well, but that night I decided to take a detour that few use. I do it from time to time to avoid traffic or simply to vary the route. That highway is more solitary. It's surrounded by hills and there are hardly any cars. I like it because it's faster, but being honest, there's something about it that has always made me uncomfortable. It was around 2 in the morning when I saw her. A light on the horizon, way in the distance. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was a street light or maybe another car, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any of those things. That light wasn't moving, wasn't blinking. It was just there, fixed in the same place. I didn't know where it was coming from, but it didn't look normal. So I decided to slow down. The light was right at the edge of the highway, in a place where there shouldn't be anything. I started to feel uneasy, with a strange sensation in my chest, as if something wasn't right. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just that light floating at the edge of the road, illuminating a small patch of Texas scrubland. I don't know why, but something in my head was telling me I shouldn't stop, so I pressed the accelerator a bit and continued on my way. When I left it behind, I felt relief, but the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. That image of the light kept wandering through my mind. I tried to dismiss it from my thoughts, but I couldn't. It was as if something was telling me that not everything was right. I arrived in San Antonio and parked at a rest stop to sleep a few hours before returning to Dallas. But although I was tired, I couldn't sleep well. I closed my eyes, and the light came back to appear in my mind. I felt like I was missing something, as if I hadn't seen everything I was supposed to see. Even so, I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just a firefly or some reflection from a sign, or I don't know what. With dawn, I got ready to return. The day made everything feel more normal, less strange. Time passed, and when I reached the stretch where I had seen the light, I decided to reduce speed, just out of curiosity and to end my doubts about what I saw that night. When I got to that point, I felt a knot in my stomach. There it was, a white cross at the edge of the highway, almost hidden among the mesquite bushes. I stopped the truck, got out, and walked toward the cross. It wasn't big and seemed to have been there for a long time. The wood was weathered, and you could barely read what it said, but I managed to distinguish a name and a date. 15 years ago, someone had died in that place. I stood there looking at it, not knowing what to think. The air was very cold even though the sun had already risen, and everything felt strange. At that moment, a thought came to my head. The light I had seen the night before wasn't a firefly or a sign. It wasn't something normal. I'm almost sure that light was the spirit of someone who died in that place. Someone who hadn't been able to rest in peace. I'm not one of those who believe in those things, but that thought invaded me. I felt that person was trapped somehow, that their soul was still there, wandering on the highway, looking for someone to see them or remember them. I couldn't help but feel sadness for that stranger. I got back in the truck, and as I was driving away, I looked in the rearview mirror. I don't know if my mind already had me influenced or if I really saw it, but it seemed like a small light was shining right where the cross was. I didn't want to stop anymore. I continued on my way in silence, but with the sensation that I had witnessed something out of the ordinary, something completely paranormal. After that day, I never took that detour again. I haven't told my experience to many people. I only mention from time to time what I saw to other truckers without expecting them to believe me. But inside me, I know what I saw. That light was the soul of someone who hadn't been able to rest, maybe trapped in limbo. I don't know what kept them there, but I feel that, for a moment, I was a witness to something that doesn't belong to this world. The strange thing is that a few weeks later, I was talking to another driver at a truck stop in Austin. He was an old-timer, been driving these roads for over 40 years. When I casually mentioned the stretch of highway where I saw the light, his expression changed completely. "You saw it too, huh?" he said, setting down his coffee cup. "Mile marker 247. I was stunned. I hadn't mentioned any mile marker, but now that he said it, I remembered seeing that exact number on a sign just before the curve where the light appeared. "Listen, son," he continued, lowering his voice. "I've been seeing that light on and off for the past 20 years, always in the same spot, always around 2 in the morning. But here's the thing that'll really get to you. I looked into it once, did some research at the local library." He paused, looking around as if making sure no one else was listening. "That cross marks where a young woman died, but she wasn't in a car accident. She was walking along the highway at night, trying to get to the hospital in San Antonio. Her little girl was sick, and she didn't have a car. A trucker found her body the next morning. She'd collapsed from exhaustion about half a mile from where that cross stands now." My blood ran cold as he continued. "But here's what really bothers me about it. The date on that cross, it's from 15 years ago, just like you said. But the newspaper reports I found were from 23 years ago. Someone's been changing that cross, updating it. And every time they do, the light appears more frequently." I asked him what he thought it meant, but he just shook his head. "I think someone, or something, is using that poor woman's story. Maybe feeding off the tragedy, keeping her spirit trapped there so it can lure other people to that spot. I've heard of 3 accidents near mile marker 247 in the past 5 years. All at night, all around 2 in the morning. That conversation changed everything for me. What I had initially thought was a peaceful encounter with a lost soul now seemed much more sinister. Was that light really the spirit of the woman who died trying to save her child? Or was it something else entirely? Something that wanted drivers to stop, to get out of their trucks in that lonely spot? I never found out for sure, and I don't want to. But every time I drive through that part of Texas, even during the day, I make sure to keep my speed up and my doors locked. Because sometimes, the things we think are reaching out for help are actually reaching out for something much worse. And late at night, when I'm driving other highways in other states, I sometimes see lights in the distance that don't belong there. I always keep driving, and I never, ever stop to investigate. Some lights are meant to guide us home, but others are meant to make sure we never get there at all. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.